Grant's not here. Grant, here he is. Grant, we need you. All right, thank you very much. Our third working group presentation concerns audit firm governance and how firms incentivize their employees. And as you know, audit firm governance is connected to independence and professional skepticism, two topics that the Investor Advisory Group has taken up in the recent past. And as I previously mentioned, Grant Callery has very graciously agreed to lead this working group, and working with Grant are Brandon Becker, Kurt, Joe, and Larry Shover. So with that, Grant, we turn it over to you.
Good. Well, we are going to do this as sort of a tag team. Each of the people in the working group has got a few slides that they're going to talk to, and if I can make this thing work, I will try to keep the slides up with the conversation. You know, as the topic of governance and incentives, and we try to look at it from the standpoint of the investor, obviously. And the slides that we've put together are a group of issues that are by no means all inclusive in this area of governance. I think they sort of flow together. The incentives and the various things that the firms are doing, the business mixes, are all lead into, you know, what should we do about this, and if anything. And a lot of it, I think, comes back to comments that Barbara Roper made this morning and Lynn made, you know, this 900-pound gorilla in the room of how the audits are paid for, and so we're sort of assuming the current state on that, and then we're looking at things that might be red flags, and what are the mitigating events that we could put in to help. And I think when you look at any of those mitigating type things, you've got to think about it from a cost-benefit perspective. You know, how much bang for the buck are you going to get? Is it really going to get you where you want to be, and at what cost? But I think there's some as you go through the slides, there's some interesting points here that really sort of point in the direction of, at least we have to keep our eye on the ball here, because we saw problems 10 years ago, 12 years ago, whatever, and is there creep in the firms of things going in the direction that where the audit could again find itself not sacrosanct? And it's a difficult balancing, because you've got a large piece of the firms that are doing straight business, and then you've got this public trust piece. And creating the proper balance, I think, is important for that. So why don't we'll go through the slides, and as I said, these are just to sort of stimulate your thinking, and we'd love to, are there other issues, are there other factors out there, other mitigation that can be in place? So I think it worked. Auditor evaluations and incentives. And actually, let me talk about our working group for 1 second. We had an interesting blend of people. A number of us are new to this group, so we were working from a clean slate. I'm clearly not an auditor. I'm a lawyer, but I know about governance in the private sector, regulatory sector. We've got Kurt, who is an auditor by training and by prior vocation, but who is with a large investor in both the public and private markets. We've got Larry, who is an investor with a trading background. We've got Brandon, who has some similar background pieces to me in the securities regulatory world, but is also with a large institutional investor. And then we've got Joe, who is the font of all knowledge. So
that's why he's over there.
and was able, has read everything and hopefully steered some of us who are less steeped in the mystique in the right direction. But Kurt is our lead off, and
Thanks, Grant. So really I wanted to start kind of really what were the observations, that the PCAOB has seen in its inspection process really related to partner incentives and the partner evaluation process. And there's a lot of words on that page, but suffice it to say that at least as of this 2008 report, there continue to be situations where audit quality did not appear to be a significant factor in the partner evaluation process, or its role in the process was unclear. And the next page essentially is kind of saying the same thing, that it was also noted that technical personnel who were responsible for audit quality were reporting to and evaluated by those whose responsibilities included maintaining and growing the audit practice. So the clear, obvious conflict. Now, as you think about these firms, I mean, they're businesses. So if you flip the slide, they're going to need to have metrics in place to drive successful businesses. And all the firms will have slightly different kind of performance drivers that they want to measure. But quality A needs to be one of those. And more importantly, if you flip the slide, we think it really needs to be the key metric. So, to the extent that it's not otherwise happening, the firms really should not rate their audit personnel higher than their audit quality rating. Seems kind of obvious, but some of the information back would suggest that that may not be occurring. Partners in other service lines that contribute to the audit process really need to have the quality of their audit input be part of their evaluation process. So if you're in the evaluations service line or tax or whatever, and you're supporting the audit brethren, that support needs to be valued or measured from a quality perspective. And last, firm leadership needs to be evaluated based on the quality of the audit practice. I think this is especially important as you start to see some of the firm leaderships no longer coming from the assurance practice. So as you see shift in kind of where the leaders are from their historical background, that's going to be really key. But you also need to obviously define quality. So our earlier conversation on audit quality indicators is key. We need to know kind of what is audit quality. Once you have audit quality theoretically defined, then you can really write the standards, have that drive training. To the extent those things aren't linked, that's a problem. I don't know how you drive audit quality without standards that are kind of linked back to it. If you think about culture in the firm, the culture has got to be really important, both in terms of driving continuous improvement and celebrating quality so that you know what the best practices are, but you also have a basic mindset. Often in many of the firms, audit quality, or where the value is within the accounting knowledge. So people that are really good at solving complex accounting issues in the national offices, that's different than the people that are in charge of the audit methodology. And having that also be of importance, and to the extent that we're going to inspect and need both to occur well, the firms internally need to have really the status of both of those being equally important. If you flip the slide, some of this is motherhood and apple pie. I mean, the one thing that I think is hard for some of the firms, it's easy to punish bad players or clear negligence. The harder challenge, I think, is to provide rewards for jobs well done, especially when it's not always clear that someone no problem. The surfacing of the non-surfacing of an issue doesn't mean that it was great. So how do you go in and make sure what really is the root cause of a good audit and reward those people that are really doing it? It really needs to be assessed by those in the audit practice. People outside that are responsible for market share shouldn't be, making the quality determinations. I think the global issue is going to become increasingly problematic. I mean, many of, our companies operate globally. And so to the extent that you have, a different standard outside of the U.S. as it relates to how those people are being evaluated, it's going to be a problem. It's going to show up in potentially deficiencies. And then, last, I'd say it has to be transparent. So, really that incentive process within the firms for both reward and for punishment really needs to be transparent. Maybe not with respect to the individual, maybe so with respect to the individual, but clearly with respect to the behavior that's key good or bad, and the reaction to that's got to be transparent in order to really to drive culture and drive kind of really the way the rest of the firm is going to operate. With that, I'll turn it over to Larry.
Wow. Larry Shover. I thought I had an easy topic. You know, I'm not an auditor, accountant, or a lawyer, and I just realized this is a very challenging topic. It's half science and it's half art, just like trading, successful trading. It's easy to throw stones at the industry, and I'll try to be half full, but we do live in a fundamentally flawed era in regards to auditing, in the sense that I'm under the watchful eye of the CFTC and the SEC, and it doesn't make sense to me how I have to pay for somebody to watch my books. It's maybe we can make some baby changes, but I want to give you a disclaimer so at least you know where I'm coming from, being not an auditor or an accountant. Sometimes when it comes to talent acquisition or attracting talent, in the whole space, we think that it's easy just to shrug our shoulders and keep the status quo. Some of us want to blow up the whole model and start fresh, and we know that that's, you know, not going to happen. But I think we can, through agitation and education, we can, you know, change something. At the core of my being, I just feel like there's no higher calling, you know, other than being a priest or a teacher or a doctor, than managing someone else's money. I really believe that. And I used to not manage other people's money. It used to be just mine. But now that I do that, I'm very, very interested in all this. So the first thing about, is the profession attracting sufficient talent? Notice the word sufficient. I mean, I think it is sufficient from everyone I've spoken with. However, it could be better. And that's really because sufficient talent's not being retained in the industry. And it sounds very half-empty, because what do we do to change that? But within the audit practice versus migrating to other service lines, I mean, that's very typical. And as I was speaking with Kurt this morning, the trek to becoming a partner in an auditing firm seems to be a lot longer than in other firms, like in accounting firms, et cetera. So it's hard. How do you retain top-rated performers within the industry? And that goes to the point of it's hard to reward people in this industry. And I think it goes back to the point that we just need to hold other people's money and watching other people's money in the highest regard. And I think with that said, I honestly think that the whole auditing industry should be paid a lot better than it is. In a way. And money is not going to solve all the issues by any stretch of the imagination, but if we do hold things in higher regard, I do think that would be a baby step. Next one, yep. How is the audit profession perceived? By management, investors, regulators, audit committees, and auditors. For most of us, including me, until I started managing other people's money, it was just a general annoyance. You know, just with a lot of fear and trepidation, making sure that we did everything correctly, that they wouldn't find something. We never did anything incorrectly or even close to being incorrect, so I never had to worry about hiring somebody off the main line, but it's more of an annoyance. But how has the profession evolved? I think it's become, pardon me, more relevant as opposed to less relevant, especially after Bernie Madoff, and also the crisis in 2008, 2009. And I think a lot of people would agree with that. The status of the industry has a long way to go, in my opinion, because although it's been elevated, the status has been slightly elevated, the compensation I don't think is there. It's not a satisfaction type job long term, in my view. Just again, just about rewarding good or bad behavior. I mean, it's really hard to figure out good ways to compensate people for good work. And lastly, the stress level. I asked a lot of auditors, including the one that audited the mutual fund just a few weeks ago, and I get it. The look in their eyes. It is a very stressful job. Has the audit industry been commoditized? That, along with compliance, absolutely. It absolutely has. And that's one of the problems, I think, and something we could work on changing. It is a commoditized product. And how do we want the profession to be perceived? And maybe you think I'm irrelevant or speaking into the dark, but again, if we view other people's money as it's humbling experience, and dealing with that on everyday level, I think the perception of somebody who's actually auditing your books would go up as well. Do we know and should we care? Is talent acquisition and retention being measured? If so, is there an issue? Now, I don't think it's being measured in any credible way. Maybe somebody here could differ with that, but I haven't seen anything where it's being measured, and I'm not even sure how that could be done. Are surveys being conducted across firms? What lessons or best practices can we learn to improve talent in the profession? And that goes back to some of its compensation, some of it's tracked to becoming a partner and having a vested interest in the firm. And should the PCAOB assess the health of the profession? And I say emphatically, yes, they should. And I definitely have some ideas offline that could help with that.
Okay. So the second piece is the governance issues, and as I said before, a lot of these first questions flow into are there governance reactions, are there governance structures that should be put in place that will resolve some of the issues that we've raised. And Joe's going to start and talk about the tone at the top and the transparency reports. And there are a number of things that have come out over the past several years, some of which the UK has been sort of taking the lead on, which go to some of these governance issues. And one of the questions that comes up a little later is, should we be mimicking them in some degree to give that opportunity? But Joe.
Thanks, Grant. So we decided to, in trying to look at tone at the top, made an effort to be as balanced as we could be here. So we examined the transparency reports, the most recent ones we were able to get for each of the big four. And so you see various, these are essentially paraphrases, but very close to the actual quote out of the transparency reports from Deloitte and Ernst on this slide. And in the case of Deloitte, saying that audit quality is the #1 priority, saying that they tie compensation of their partners to their performance in terms of audit quality, E&Y emphasizing the tone at the top and how that's the responsibility of the senior management team, and that no client is more important than the reputation. And then KPMG and PwC, again, KPMG talking about an absolute commitment to audit quality, and that policies at KPMG will enable their partners' employees to act with integrity, skepticism, and objectivity. PwC, again, talking about firm leadership, and it's emphasizing its commitment to quality, top priority. And then again, talking about, in the second bullet there for PwC, how compensation for people in the firm is tied to quality. And I would say, just anecdotally, my interactions with the leadership of really all the firms, both when I was on the SAG and just in other settings, is, these people generally very impressive, and I think really believe this and try very hard to live it. But negative, clearly there are some negative signs as it relates to this, and we have some things out of the UK, particularly the Financial Times and the UK Competition Commission, and talking about the first quote there really mirrors what Barbara Roper said earlier, and that is, the basic structure of the profession is such that it makes it very hard to always put the public interest first, that investor interests are being neglected because they only play a small role in hiring audit firms compared with that of management. Maybe, as Ann Simpson said earlier, maybe some of that responsibility falls on investors. Maybe they're not getting the information they need to cast informed votes, but they certainly often approve the auditor overwhelmingly. And that misaligned incentives mean that auditors tend to focus on management interests over those of shareholders. And then there's a paper that we have a number of quotes from. I've talked about this paper before. It just came out in the most recent issue of Contemporary Accounting Research. And it's a pretty amazing paper in that these authors were able to get access for the actual proposal documents that were submitted by each of the major firms on two large Canadian companies, one of which is a public company that's cross-listed in the United States, so would clearly have some effect here in terms of PCAOB and SEC oversight. And they actually went through, not only interviewed these people, but went through the written documents. And so they talk about it as Client 1 and Client 2. So auditors adopted the mottos and slogans of Client 1 and Client 2 in their proposals and presentations because they wanted to show, we're a fit with your organization. One particular dimension of reputation that interested Client 1 was whether other CFOs, so when the prospective client would call around to other CFOs, the CFO wanted to know, is the auditor rigid, which is undesirable, or flexible, which is desirable? The authors of this paper saw no evidence of reputation with investors or any third-party users being in consideration. Didn't even come up. Wasn't even discussed. Client 1 made it clear that they wanted all complex accounting issues to be resolved by the engagement partner. And auditors 2 and 3 responded by promising that the final and binding decision would be made by the engagement partner. One firm promised that they, and this is a quote, they do not hide behind the head office. That kind of language is very troubling, at least to me. No meeting between the prospective auditors and the audit committee as a whole was held without the presence of company executives. CFO had to be there, CEO had to be there. Again, what does that say? What, I got to babysit these people? Next slide. Okay, back to you, Grant. Oh, wait, no, you wanted me to talk about the ads. So let me,
Yeah.
we had in addition to this, and we had in our first slide deck, and then I thought, we did a search on ads that the firms are using. And we found some, and we did what we could to disguise who the firm was, but I still was concerned that maybe it could be, you might be able to figure it out. So I have a couple of them here, so rather than being a slide, I'll just read the relevant language. So this is an ad in a periodical that probably many of you have seen. To ensure success of your most critical SOX initiatives, you need to hire a service provider that can help you gain a competitive advantage. Okay, so that's kind of the language that I found interesting. And then another ad, whether it's accounting, tax, or consulting, we're focused on listening to your needs, then desiring solutions that fit with your budget, your timeline, your corporate culture, and vision. And again, not that any of those is necessarily egregious, but I think it does say, if you're willing to say that publicly, what are you doing privately? And what is it saying about who you really value and where is the linchpin of the relationship? Grant?
Okay. Yeah, and so I think as we looked at these things, we started to think about, well, what are the types of mitigation tactics that can be used, and one is to have an independent look at what's going on in the firm, where you can have people who are privy to the information, privy to the business decisions of the firm, privy to the tactical decisions of the firm, and to be able to act as a brake if things start to snowball in the wrong direction with respect to the audit function within the firm. And there have been a couple of things in the last 5 years that have gone in that direction. The Advisory Committee on the Audit Profession, which was established by the Treasury Department, had a report come out in 2008, and it had a number of recommendations on firm structure and finance. But the one that is most relevant to this is recommendation number 3, which urged the PCAOB and the SEC to study and enable as appropriate the feasibility of firms appointing independent members with full voting authority to firm boards and/or advisory boards. Now, I know there are certainly a whole range of issues of putting from partnership law to, some of the professional codes of ethics and the like, for putting people onto the actual governing board of a partnership. But I think, the advisory board is a possibility, and these people would be looking to focus on the governance issues and to be able to advise the firms as to, what was happening, and be able to keep an eye on things. In the UK, the Financial Regulatory Council in 2010, which was 2 years after the U.S. study, did come out with a proposal that applies to the firms that do the most audits within the UK, and particularly on the main market of the London Stock Exchange, and it calls for the appointment of independent non-executives. And the INEs have roles that are focused on shareholder confidence in the public interest. They need to have a body that oversees public interest issues, and they have a duty of care to the firm. The firm needs to disclose criteria for assessing INE's impact on the firm and their degree of independence. And they have rights to firm information and to disclose disagreements with the firm, not unlike some of the Sarbanes-Oxley provisions, the reporting up and reporting out and that type of thing, where there is there is ability to not have this stay within the firm and not see the light of day. So I think, we think that, and I assume that is on the PCAOB's agenda somewhere. I don't think I've seen anything where you've gotten to do anything formal on it at this point, but I think you're working through the Treasury Department's recommendations, and where there were a lot. And I think as a group we think that is something that you ought to get on the table, and you ought to take a look at and see whether this is a way to put in a sort of a firewall that will allow there to be people focused on the public interest, and the investor's perspective, who will know what's going on in the firms, to be able to assess whether things are moving in directions that they shouldn't be. There has been some experience with the UK entities, and Joe actually had some conversations with people who have had experience with that process, and he'll tell us a little bit about those.
Yeah, so as we worked on this, Grant and I decided that it made sense for me to reach out to some people in London who've worked with this pretty closely. So I did reach out and had quite a lengthy conversation with a senior ICAEW executive about UK firms' experiences with the Audit Firm Governance Code, specifically with respect to the independent non-executives. And what I was told is that the firms who initially were somewhat skeptical of this, they were not overjoyed about it, are now quite positive about what they have done. In fact, they're quite proud of what they've done. And as I understand that, there's a requirement embedded in that statute for there to be a review in 2014 as to how it's worked. And the firms are quite anxious to have that review done, because I think they're very proud of how they've implemented this. And the effect. There was flexibility built into that rule in the United Kingdom, and given firms the ability to implement the code in different ways. And the implementation has largely followed how the firms have organized their organizational structures. So Ernst & Young has chosen to implement this on a global basis. I think we all know Mark Olson, Jim's predecessor, in terms of permanent PCAOB chairman, and Mark's involved in the E&Y group. KPMG has done it on a European basis. Deloitte's done it on a UK basis, but as I understand it, the way Deloitte's organized in the UK, they actually own some firms in the Middle East, and so they're kind of scoped onto that. And then PwC on a UK basis. So we had quite a good conversation, and we got toward the end, and I said to this individual, I said, yes, this is all very helpful, but here's really the important question. Has it changed behavior? And what he said is the firms look at many issues differently after installing INEs. That the kind of the lens and how they look at issues, how they evaluate issues, how they make decisions has changed in his view, suggesting that behavior has in fact changed. Another piece of information, my guess is the board already knows this, but in the United States, as I understand it, Deloitte is moving somewhat in this direction voluntarily. They have established an advisory group. It's not exactly the same as what we see here in the United Kingdom. They've established an advisory group that Dan Gelser's chairing, and that Phil Wiedemeyer, Arnie Hainish, Silvana Palmrose, all people we know quite well, and then a fifth person who I don't know, are on this group. And so, maybe the firms will do this voluntarily, and there's nothing for the PCAOB to do, but the bully pulpit works too. You don't always have to do things through regulation. Grant?
Yeah, next one.
Yeah, so the other thing we did before I turn it back to Grant is, in the lead into this, he talked a little bit about consulting. Certainly Jim's has given a number of speeches about concern about the rapid growth of consulting vis-a-vis the much slower growth of audit. So we decided to look at the numbers. And so these are the numbers across the three firms based on their own published information, and this is for the United States. And you see the split. And, Deloitte is the only one that never spun off their consulting practices. The other three did. And so Deloitte, reflecting that, is quite heavy in terms of consulting vis-a-vis the other two practice lines. The other three firms, given that they've had to rebuild the consulting practices, clearly still have those practices not as large as audit, but given the trend lines in terms of the growth rates of those two practices, doesn't take a lot of imagination to envision a future scenario where consulting may be larger than audit again. So there's just data. Certainly, I think the board's paying attention to this. One thing, though, that may be worth thinking about is it's not clear to me, and we talked about this a bit this morning at breakfast, whether all consulting is created equal. And so there are certain types of consulting that one could argue are more related to the audit skill set, and in fact, one could argue are in fact, if not public interest services, at least quasi-public interest services, risk consulting, forensic accounting, anti-money laundering controls, various compliance type services. And it's certainly not the audit, but there's an element of public interest associated with those versus what I would call more pure consulting, which might be large-scale ERP-based systems implementation, management, strategy consulting, things of that nature. It might be useful, and maybe the board's already gathering this information, to have that split for your purposes, if not for public consumption. Because again, it's not clear that all consulting necessarily poses the same risks.
Okay. Right. Well, I guess most people are sort of informed by their background, and I may be a little off in the stratosphere here from the standpoint of not being an auditor or having a lot of experience. But as I looked at this issue, and particularly the last slide, and again, Joe's caveats on the last slide are very important ones, because the numbers look like there's a lot of consulting creeping back in, but it's important to understand what the consulting is, because I think you've got complex issuers that the firms need lots of resources to be able to do a good audit, and some of those are in the consulting side of the world and not the strict auditing, and so there's a real balancing you need to do about which is the cart and which is the horse. Because otherwise you've got to go outside to get those resources, and if you've got them internally, but you can't just have them for the audit purposes because they got to pay the freight, so it's difficult. But as I looked at it, one of the things that occurred to me is if this balance starts to shift again in the direction that makes it difficult for audit, is a couple of things that I have lived through in my prior life. You look at the way the markets operate and were structured. They're self-regulatory organizations. They had and still have multiple functions. They're market operators, and they are regulators of those markets and the participants in those markets. And I think there is an analogy between the audit function and the regulatory operations piece of those organizations, and then the non-audit function and the market operations. And this really came to the fore back in the mid-90s when NASDAQ was growing wildfire and became a very dominant part of what was then NASD, and in fact, too dominant. And we had a run-in with the SEC and an administrative proceeding against NASD coming out of the what was then the price-fixing issues in NASDAQ. And I think that there was a feeling, and there was a long 21A report that the commission wrote that talked about the lack of independence, the lack of the separation of the functions, and that the cart, in fact, was leading the horse if NASDAQ was the cart. And the commission hasn't given up on those issues. I think in 2004, they issued a concept release on self-regulation where it raised some of the same issues. It's as competition grows, are these conflicts that are built into these kind of separated things exacerbated? Has internal separation of functions worked? And can conflicts like this be effectively managed through governance changes, which sort of goes back to the prior discussion of the independent non-executives? Is that enough? And the commission is looking at it again. I mean, the Commissioner Gallagher is very interested in the whole structure of SROs. And so I think those kinds of conflicts are going to be talked about and written about again. And I think they are at least a sort of a learning piece for thinking about the way an audit function works within a larger accounting firm. And with that, I believe is the end of our presentation. So we would open it up for discussion of anything that any of us have talked about. And Brandon, do you have any wrap-up points that you'd?
Well, you certainly raised a large number of issues. I'm not quite sure where to start, and I think others will have, have questions of their own. I don't know whether to start with the issue of culture, which you raised at the outset. We can talk about that, but the term the audit becoming commoditized is beginning to be used all the time now. I'm not sure what that means, and I'm not sure what the implications are for the PCAOB and what our role ought to be in terms of overseeing such commoditization, in terms of looking at the prices that are associated with commoditized professions. So if you could talk a little bit about the commoditization first and the culture second, or the culture first and the commoditization second, I'll start with that.
So I'll try. When I think about commoditization, I really think about it becoming just that. It's the lowest price, focus on price. It's the view that the auditor is the bean counter. It's the view that the auditor really doesn't have anything that meaningful to say. Now, obviously that's not true, but it gets into the whole concept of how is the profession perceived. Now, it's easy to talk in generalities, and it's easy to talk, one size fits all, but that's then where I think the pressure does come to measure. And do we know kind of how is the profession doing? How is it perceived? What's the status of an audit partner within an audit committee meeting or within a board meeting? to the extent that their voice matters or doesn't matter. These are important questions because it speaks to the ability to, why should the junior person within that firm choose to stay if, they're not relevant? Goes back to the culture of the firm and the like. I mean, so I think it's, the prior conversations, we all want the profession to be strong, to be able to communicate the hard messages, to be able to stand up for the public interest. And I think those things can be very exciting in really what will attract people to the profession. I don't believe it's all about compensation, but dollars need to be on the table. And if I have a choice between maybe going into a consulting practice or, auditing controls, what might be more fun? I mean, that's the hard part here. I mean, this isn't easy, one size fits all, but it is about kind of, what keeps, this stuff interesting and retain status. And, it's very easy, I think, for the firms to say, well, the inspection process creates undue stress. It contributes possibly, but it's all these other factors around relevancy of what's being done, and it's very easy to kind of discount the auditor as the bean counter.
Could now turn it over to Grant, to moderate the questions and to recognize the tense. But if each of you could focus on what you view the role of the PCAOB to be with respect to either culture, or commoditization, or otherwise, as you reflect on your remarks, that would be helpful as well.
Who wants to?
Your mic's on, so maybe it's you.
Well, I guess I think of it as sort of and not necessarily specifically in the rulemaking function or whatever, but the sort of an overview of the profession and whether there are avenues that the firms ought to be pursuing, somewhat the bully pulpit, your ability to have conversations with the firms as you work with them to see. I think there needs to be drilling down into some of these issues. I mean, you look at that chart and you say, okay, these percentages look a little scary. Does it mean that the audit function is becoming the poor stepchild of the consulting and other functions? And that is the commoditization. Is it really? Are the companies just going out and saying, give me a bid and I'm gonna bite the lowest bidder? But I think a lot of it, particularly in the transparency reports, put out some information about the firms, but I think you can get a lot more detailed information to see whether a chart like that is something to worry about or something not to worry about. And so I think you have a unique position to be able to gather information from the firms to then make more informed decisions rather than knee-jerk decisions based on something that looks, on its surface like an issue.
It's easy to have these conversations in the fact-free environment. So we really, that's really where my request to PCAOB is let's get some facts. Let's, get some, and I think the firms have a lot of this information. So it's really a matter of kind of, requesting from them and then making some evaluations around it. I also think on the slide that was raised on kind of percentages, i.e. tax, audit, consulting, the other piece that speaks to commoditization is what I would refer to as the make-take ratios. So if I'm a partner in the audit practice, am I taking home more than I'm making for the firm? Or how does that ratio work? And if I am taking home more than I'm making, or if I'm just purely making less than my other service lines, it's a problem. And we've lived that story before. And so we ought to be mindful of that. And that seems like something that ought to be measurable, that we ought to be able to track and kind of understand. And that, I think, speaks a little bit to the commoditization, right? Because if the audit practice is not that profitable relative to the others, what's the market saying about it? And some of it gets to, are the audit firms selling assurance, or are they just kind of, how aggressive are they in kind of going out and creating new assurance products and taking that on? And I'd like to see them kind of step up and do more in that area. Now, that's probably beyond what the PCAOB can do, but it's part of where I think, the profession, the health, in terms of assessing the health of the profession, it's important.
I would only add that I do think, Grant alluded to it earlier, that there is a close connection between the audit quality indicators we talked about this morning and then seeing those feed into the governance process. And it does seem to me that the board can help through the inspection process make sure that there's a connection between those two things. It's harder for me to see the board, qua the board, necessarily increasing the fees the assurance function generates. It's just not well structured for the board to do that, but it can try to focus on whether or not those quality indicators are going into the evaluation of individual partners and their compensation, and if there's a realistic governance process that incorporates that.
Steve, I'll add a few things too, because you asked, for suggestions for the things the board could do. So, one thing is efforts to make the audit more valuable. I think the board's trying to do that with the audit report. I think they're trying to do that with audit quality indicators. I talked about early this morning the need to work more closely with the SEC and the FASB to really understand how investors are making decisions, what information they're using, and what role there is for auditors to provide assurance around that information. Tie, as part of the inspection process, to make sure that firms are really tightly linking compensation and advancement to quality. There's been a discussion in the AQI project of surveys, potentially, of people inside the firm, and that can be useful, but if you really want to know what the culture is like in an organization, survey people who've left. That will tell you the truth. Quality control standards, Marty's working on that now. Again, the importance in those of firm governance, the importance potentially of INEs, maybe that's not through rule, but that's through, again, the bully pulpit. And then fees. Again, maybe you guys monitor this, but if there's a 30% or a 40% decline in the fee, automatically, to me, that's going to be inspected. And I would make that transparent, because what you do by doing that is you probably put a floor on a decline in fees. All of a sudden, you're not going to see that anymore.
Okay. Okay, well, why don't we do the reverse of what we did and start over here and work our way around the table this direction?
Thanks, Grant. Extremely interesting subject. Just a little background. I sit on 2 audit committees, and I'm a CFO of an organization. And with respect to that organization, we just went through a process to pick another auditor. Rotation was desired, and a fresh look was important. But not a single firm that proposed talked about the quality factors. It was all about the cultural fit factors, the competency of accounting or tax or risk management or whatever issue they thought was important to us. None of them talked about the quality factors. And I noted at lunch with some folks that you don't see the firms competing on quality. So to your question, Steve, if there's a way for the PCAOB to make quality indicators or quality factors not just transparent but unbiased, so that the buyer of the service could evaluate quality along with other factors, because the audit will become a commodity if quality is not part of the decision-making process. It'll just be price or more of the social factors. And that, we picked an auditor that we thought was both reasonably priced and high quality, but we had to dig to find the quality factors. They didn't bring them forward.
So, a couple of things. On on the, one of the things that struck me in the tone at the top and the quotes from the various firms, I don't know if any of you have looked at all at the Department of Justice's lawsuit against S&P, S&P credit rating agency, Standards & Poor's. They made exactly the same kind of assurances that we have the highest standards, objective, ratings, based, and they get into court, they're challenged in court, and they say, but that was puffery. No, I mean, that's their first defense. That was puffery. No one really took that seriously. So while I think, and that's how I look at those kinds of quotes, is, seriously, that is a very easy sentence to write and doesn't necessarily mean anything about the actual culture in the firm. I would commend for your reading pleasure a recent study from FINRA on conflicts of interest. It deals with a similar situation in that it's dealing with broker-dealers who have a number of inherent conflicts of interest in their business model, a business model that's pervaded by conflicts of interest, and then addresses a range of issues about how they are expected to identify, manage, and mitigate those conflicts of interest. And one of the things that comes through when you read about this is there are certain inherent conflicts of interest. There's an inherent conflict of interest in this business model for auditors. But they make choices that make those conflicts worse. So if you compensate based on your success in attracting business, or if you punish creating conflicts with clients because you're too tough or whatnot, you are taking an inherent conflict of interest and magnifying it many times. So it's much more harmful. And I'm not sure, I don't know this area as well as I know the broker-dealer area, but in the broker-dealer area, they make lots of choices that magnify the conflicts of interest. And what I think is interesting about the FINRA report, which is designed to be a report that the firms can use to drive them toward better practices, with the promise that FINRA will be there looking for improvements, is that it forces you to think very consciously about identifying the conflicts. What are you going to do to manage them? What are you going to do to mitigate them? And I think it makes it at least somewhat more difficult to make the choice, to justify the choice to make them worse. And so, I think there is potential in that model for something that the board could do that would be concrete. I mean, this study is obviously the product of a number of interviews, extensive interviews over a period of time with the firms to examine the sort of state of play within the firms, and it looks in specific areas where they think, conflicts of interest are particularly relevant, including compensation practices as one, and identifies best practices. And I think it's something that the board could look at with the, certainly with the larger audit firms, but, across doing a similar kind of evaluation with a similar goal of driving toward better practices in the firms.
Stan?
If some of this has to deal with the underpricing, I think you can deal with it on the question of independence. If, in other words, if you are pricing your audit at a price which some standard would say is not feasible, that it's too low, then that I think raises an independence question. How are you going to be able to deal with it? It's something that what Levitt did on the independence issues when he was at the SEC. At least you could be, even if you're not the decision maker on independence, you clearly could do the study and send it to the SEC, because the SEC can do that. But I think there's some of these things that you can say, if the conflict is so great, there is an independence issue. The government, as you know, has an anti-deficiency rule that you can't people can't contribute to the government. And I think it's going to be hard to do, but I do think an auditor that is engaged in practices which would compromise his ability to be able to write a clean opinion does raise the issue whether how independent the auditor is.
I think this committee did excellent work, so thank you for your time and efforts. My comment directly addressing your point, Steve, what can the PCAOB do? I think this idea of the INEs, which is something that I was not really aware of prior to your presentation, is extremely interesting. I think any time that you have an independent set of eyes come in with a metric that is focused primarily on quality as opposed to market share or revenue per partner is probably the best way to disinfect against any bad practices that might be occurring at the time. So my questions to the committee might be, where are we meaning United States and specifically the PCAOB, where are we in studying the potential adoption of INEs here? And then, again, to your point, Kurt, it's great to discuss things when it's not factually based, but do we have any tangible facts, aside from sort of the suggestion that behavior has changed, that would create greater impetus behind adopting INEs in the United States?
I think that question would go to that end of the table, if, at least as to where the PCAOB is with respect to the INEs.
It's not been lost on us that the firms are moving in that direction, and some of the representatives of that movement are here. There's also been, I think, significant attempt at the top of the firm, the global firms, to start presenting the global network as a more coordinated, less disparate and dysfunctional business enterprise itself. And that has to, in part, with the efforts of Louis Ferguson and other colleagues around the world who are sharing a lot of information about how the global network.
I mean, it would seem to me just intuitively that if this is now in place for the large firms, and I think it's for 8 firms in the UK, and if the reaction that Joe got in the conversations as to the positive nature of it, you know, trickling that down to the U.S. operations may not be as painful, you know, a move as you might otherwise think, and that maybe, you know, with that background, you know, there may be more receptiveness to it. But
I tend to see the heads of the U.S. audit firms as being a very, very special class. I think they are, on the whole, more alert and more intent on getting to a position like this than they have been in a long time. I think that one of the things the board has accomplished without without me being here, but one of the things they've accomplished before I came is to begin to make the firms aware of what it meant to be a regulated enterprise. And it changed, in some ways, the attitude of the leadership of the U.S. firms for the better.
okay, I can't see all of the upright car. Lou, I think yours is the next.
I have both an observation and a question for you all. I mean, one of the things I thought was interesting about your information here is it shows that the firms, these accounting firms, when they compete for business, don't compete on quality. But if you think about that, and if you think about them as rational business people, what they are doing is, in fact, selling to the clients exactly what they think the clients want to hear. That the clients are not asking for audit qualities. I think we have to be aware that we live in a world here where a lot of business executives regard the audit as a regulatory necessity. It's a requirement, and therefore you get it done as cheaply as possible. You know, it's interesting in Brazil, which now is in its 2nd or 3rd year of having audit rotation required every 6 years. As a whole in Brazil, I have been told that audit fees have dropped by more than 30%, and some of the big audit networks are now raising questions, can we even do business profitably in Brazil? But my question to you is, if it is the case that auditors are giving information to their clients that they think the clients want, how do we convince the purchasers of these services that they need to be asking for different things as well? This is not just about requiring the auditors doing things. This is also about teaching the consumers of these products what the audit does and why you really ought to care about audit. So the question back to you all is, how do we do that?
Grant, let me take a first shot at that. I actually think, Lou, you've identified the essential issue. And arguably, along with the issue that Lynn said this morning, is probably the biggest issue facing the profession. The problem is I view that issue largely as an SEC issue and possibly a Department of Labor issue. And so there's two essential problems. One is, I think, in way too many cases, audit committees are not acting even remotely consistent with the spirit of Sarbanes-Oxley. And Ann and her team, I think, will have more to say about this later. And unfortunately, that's for Brian. I don't see him. I don't know where he is. But that's for Brian and his friends down there by Union Station. It's not really for the PCAOB. The other problem is, I think, in way too many cases, and this is what Ann Simpson said earlier, way too many cases, the people who are managing the money for every single person in this room in terms of their retirement, if you have a 401k or a 403b or a SEP IRA or anything, are not really, in my opinion, fulfilling their fiduciary duties as it relates to oversight of the audit and oversight of financial reporting as careful owners. And CalPERS does, Ann, but I think there's a lot of people in the investor space who just abdicate too quickly. And Lou, until those two things get fixed, we got an issue.
Okay, we are sort of at the end of our time. Steve, can we do quick round down?
No, I
this
think what
side?
I'd like to do is go around and have everybody, I think we'll just skip the break. And, because it's a good, and I want to get people out on time, I want to get the general discussion. We'll skip the break, and then we'll go right to the audit committees at 2:50. So we'll take 5 minutes off of Ann's. Why don't we go around the table and finish up this discussion and give everybody,
Okay.
Well,
we keep moving backwards because we were all the way over here.
Why don't we also say,
why don't we-
no more tent cards on this subject, and then we'll just go around the
Why don't
table
we
and we'll
pick up
conclude.
where we left off over here, and if everybody can be as crisp as possible with their comments, that would be good, and then we can get through the group. Tony.
Thanks, Grant. I'm going to respond to a question that Steve raised earlier, which I think is connected to what Lou was just saying, and that is, why is an audit a commodity? And one of the things about a commodity is that the two characteristics are low profitability and little, if any, difference in quality. But what happens in the marketplace normally is that when you get a commodity, but if there's a market, somebody comes in with a higher quality product. For example, organic food, certain kinds of chips, for example, semiconductor chips. So fundamentally, what it brings us to, why isn't there a market for high quality audits? And as Ann Simpson said very early this morning, there must be something that investors aren't doing right. Because we are the ones who ought to be demanding those higher quality audits. I mean, I happen to really, really like organic food, for example, so I go search it out. So if my money is at stake, which it is, as Joe just pointed out, then somehow the investors need to be finding a way to push this.
Grant, out of respect for our plenary authority, why don't we recognize Brian to keep on the good side of the SEC?
He's just knocked down his identity.
Yeah, thanks. Well, Joe, I know it's hard to see each other from this far away, but I just wanted to respond to Joe's comments, and certainly I take his points relative to the PCAOB's oversight authority versus SEC's relative to audit committees, but at the same time, I didn't want it to go unsaid that the PCAOB, I think, has made a lot of progress in terms of thinking about how they still can enhance the roles that audit committees have without necessarily having the direct oversight authority, including making sure that audit committees are armed with appropriate information about the inspection process and trying to do more relative to the inspection process, and communicating with audit committees on audit committee chairs on a voluntary basis through the inspection process. Obviously, there's a new audit committee communication standard that was recently finalized, and that's not to say that there's more that can't be done, because I think there is, and I think a lot of it does involve the need for close coordination between the organizations. I just wouldn't want this group to feel they shouldn't and couldn't share any ideas at all that they have relative to how things could be improved, because we do have the opportunity to certainly be working together, the two organizations, and there are things I think the PCAOB can and have already done, and so I think it's just important to acknowledge that.
This is Mike Head again. And this is such a passionate topic, especially for those of us that are raised and our profession was a CPA and an auditor. So I'm going to try to keep my comments concise and just make some observations without letting that emotional side get involved, because it's hard to separate those two things, being a 35-year CPA. But first, there's nothing wrong with a commodity. A lot of companies make a lot of money by having tighter margins and high volume in something that they have a unique skill set at, and being able to do that. The word commodity for some reason is being thrown around as a negative, when I would call it a niche, a specialization, an industry expert, a subject matter expert, and that they're providing high quality, audit quality at a very affordable price, because they do it very well, very effectively, very efficiently, and do it a lot. And if you start trying to do things that aren't your core competency, then you start not being as good. And I think those are positive attributes, not negative. So I would be cautious to worry about if auditing is a commodity or not. I hope it becomes a high quality commodity that our audit professions are proud of providing. Okay, so that's kind of an emotional statement, but I'm proud to be an auditor, and I think I want to do it efficiently and effectively at the lowest price I can, so the investors and my clients get the most value for an effective audit at a very, very high quality. So that's kind of that comment. And I think what you're seeing differently in the percentages, once you peel that onion back, is these firms are complying with their independence rules. Therefore, I'm less worried about consulting occurring, because it's got to be occurring on non-audit clients if it's not considered acceptable audit client services. And I don't think they're violating the rules. I just think that it provides a cultural opportunity to attract and retain very specialized people, that you can't spend and develop that specialization 100% of the time on the auditors. So then they use that skill set to keep them honed and subject matter experts on other non-audit consulting work that allows them to continue to be subject matter experts to be drawn on the audit clients that they're not doing the consulting work for. And again, I see that as a very positive, not as a very negative thing, and it provides cultural career opportunities for those individuals that don't necessarily want to always do the audit work that is slightly different, not as sexy, maybe not what we get up and aspire to do every day sometimes. And that's okay too. There's nothing wrong with that. Probably the last observation that I would make, which is an alternative to the independent INEs and things, and we talked about it earlier, and we thought it was an inherent conflict. And I think both the audit firms and the issuers, the companies, would not necessarily be opposed to it. Why do we not consider, why does the PCAOB not consider taking on the responsibility of assessing fees that would be used to hire the auditors and take that conflict out of the formula for the clients that the auditors are performing, and then use the audit quality indicators as, and the inspection process with the hiring and firing, if they felt it was appropriate, as a way of ensuring audit quality is of the highest. My CFO at my company cares about the relationship and the service they're getting and how they're being treated, and that they have the best auditors, as long as he felt it was, I think, and I know him pretty well, I've known him for several years, I think if he didn't think that would cause an inefficient fee assessment process, and that it would inherently cause fees to go up, but it could be managed in a very efficient way, I don't think he cares if the company's paying for it, paying directly to the firm or paying it to PCAOB. I think he worries about losing control of it being an efficient way to hire auditors versus inefficient, not who has the power. Now, maybe I'm wrong on that, but those are kind of my off-the-wall thoughts and comments, and I hope I didn't show too much emotion with that.
Lynn?
First, just to dispel this misnomer around the table, that the margins on audit work are less or significantly less than margins on consulting. The commission in its rulemaking in 2000 did get a study on that. It was done by Rick Antle at Yale University, and the firms all participated in that, and it clearly demonstrated that the highest margin, Brandon, was actually on the audit work, not on the consulting work. So that
was 2000, you said, Lynn?
Yep. And that was when they had their big consulting practices. So, and I think that may still be available out on the SEC's website. I don't know if it's still all out there or not. It was at one point in time. So the notion that the audit practice is a low margin product is just wrong, and there's no evidence to support that other than you see it pop up in newspaper stories from time to time with no supporting evidence. Second of all, the audit has not become a commodity. The audit has been a commodity for over 4 decades now. It became a commodity when in 76 to 78 timeframe, the FCTC and DOJ removed the barriers on competitive bidding and a number of other barriers that the profession had, and that immediately drove it to a much lower pricing models when the CFOs went out and started doing competitive bidding. And so the notion of commoditization is not new, and I agree with Mike wholeheartedly. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Computer servers, that's a commoditized product. Many of the chips are commoditized product. We've commoditized stockbroker fees, and you know, it's just a matter of pricing. And for most CFOs, they aren't going to see a big difference in picking one of the big four as long as they get a partner that has some industry expertise and knows what they're doing. Why wouldn't you, especially when as a CFO you're responsible for the budget and a line item in the budget, why wouldn't you go to the lowest price? Because stockholders are asking you to make the numbers for the year. It's exactly what they're incented to do. So to lose question about how you're going to educate the CFOs, I wouldn't waste my time, because it ain't going to happen. Not the way the system works. And in fact, I spoke about 2 years ago to a group of about 250 to 300 CFOs, CFO Rising, a big FEI event, a CFO event that was out in Vegas, and we did a survey of the participants in the audience, and it was driven by the fact that audit fees had been dropping at the time. some significantly, some which were discussed at the SAG at the time. And the question was raised of those in the audience whether or not it had actually been the audit committee involved with hiring and setting fees, or whether it had been the CFO, the controller, people inside the company. And at the 250 to 300 in the audience, I think there was 6 that were counted where the audit committee had done it, and the rest of it had all been negotiated by people within inside the company. So the reality is SOX is not being complied with because it's supposed to be the audit committee doing this, and there's absolutely zero enforcement of that provision of SOX by the SEC. And until that happens, that ain't going to change. So that's going to keep you in a commoditized product, and it's all those things. I agree with Joe that having the PCAOB come out and say, if you end up being the low company in the industry with the lowest audit fee, yeah, we're going to come look at you, which is common sense. I mean, that's not rocket scientist stuff. That would send a clear-cut message that perhaps you don't want to be the low guy on the totem pole. And again, the market is just said there's no difference between the 4 big firms, and that's acknowledged, so that it just isn't going to change. As far as governance goes, I think the EU and the UK have taken some good initial steps in terms of requiring more transparency about how the process works. I think that is key. And I think key to the way the firms operate in the culture, since Chairman Doty raised the question of culture, is the selection of that CEO. He's voted on by the partners. He's voted on to drive draws up. You don't elect a partner to run your firm if you're going to see a drop in your draws. You want someone to draw it up, and then that partner selects the top 10 to 20 people around him, and that CEO is setting their compensation. And all that compensation is driven by profitability within the firm. And it's because that's what the partners want, and that's just the way people behave. But until you bring some transparency to that process and the implications it has for quality, you aren't going to change the behavior. And this is one place where regulation is probably, and transparency, probably more transparency than anything, is going to be important. And I think that also relates to the INEs. People who have been around the profession know that in the late 70s there were hearings on the profession, and the notion of independent boards was put forward, and Arthur Andersen and maybe one other firm at the time went out and started creating an independent board after a number of years. It went away though because it wasn't regulated. So if you don't do any regulation, you shouldn't expect them to stick. It didn't stick the last time, and it won't stick this time either. But more importantly, it becomes a question, just as like with public company boards, how do you select the INEs? And almost every time we've seen the firms pick people in an INE or similar oversight role, they go out and pick people that are very close to them, people that they've paid significant fees to or money to do research for them or other areas. And it's basically putting a bunch of yes people on your INE. And as we've seen with corporate boards, when CEOs do that, if that's the process that you got, it's a wasted process. In fact, it's a terrible process because people expect something, and it's very misleading as to what they're actually going to get. So that's my thoughts.
We've spent a lot of time on what a commodity is, but I think it's worth probably a moment more. I think typically when we talk about commodities, we talk about simple things that can't be differentiated. And as it's been pointed out, yeah, smart business people try to turn commodities into something that's not a commodity. You can get margin out of that. The most commodity-like commodities are literally, raw iron, right? On the other hand, something like wheat, we've seen people be able to turn into not a commodity. That's what Monsanto's been busy doing for the last 20 years. A lot of people are mad at them for doing that. The audit is a strange thing, it seems to me, and it has to do with the fact that The customer is not the customer. And so different supposed customers have different relationships to the audit, some of which are commodity-like and some of which aren't. Right? The management, I think, fundamentally, in a sense, sees it as a commodity. It's a letter, and the letter says the same thing to all companies. Right? And we're having a discussion, we've had a discussion about that and whether we want that to change extensively. In an effort to kind of force the customer to accept something other than a commodity. There's a powerful force in this that to the extent the management is the actual buyer of audit services, to the extent that the audit committee does not do its job, as Lynn was suggesting, then there's a natural inclination for the whole process to become commoditized. Now, the PCAOB was, but obviously, what the audit is supposed to be is not a commodity. It is supposed to be an extremely complex and skill-dependent service. Comparable in certain ways, for example, to the practice of medicine or engineering or some of us in the legal profession would hope the law. It's supposed to be that, and investors and the general public, and I think it's really important, to talk in the aftermath of the crisis that produced the PCAOB and in the crisis that the financial crisis that we're still sort of in the midst of in certain respects. It's important to recognize that the public is a customer here in addition to investors. Investors and the public expect the audit to be not a commodity, to be this complex, judgment-driven and an integrity-filled process. And yet, of course, the investors, the public, is not the customer. Now, the audit committee is supposed to be the customer, and I tend to believe that in the aftermath of Sarbanes-Oxley, that despite what Lynn said, that in many cases there are audit committees that are trying hard to be a real customer, but this is contested terrain, right? And the reality, at least in my very limited experience of what the audit process looks like from the inside, is that you're trying to get to yes, right? The management of the company and the audit committee is trying to get to yes, is trying to get that letter, right? And to the extent, and thus there's kind of if there's a tension between commodity and non-commodity, there's actually a sort of a more fundamental goal-related tension there as well, which is that the investors and the public kind of want the truth, and typically insiders, board, management, I think in almost all cases, and audit committees, and I don't mean this by saying this to suggest that this is unethical. Or represents unethical conduct. I think it represents organizational reality. People are trying to get a job done. They're trying to get to yes so that the whole business can function. And so when they look to the extent that they're not looking for a commodity, to the extent that they're not looking for just a stamp, they're looking for an audit firm that will be a partner. This is why audit firms market themselves as partners. That will be a sophisticated, a sophisticated, knowing, understanding partner. That's really different in many respects from what investors and the public are looking for. Now, what does that suggest about the PCAOB's role? Oh, let me just say one more thing about commodification. We don't have data here in this presentation about margins. And, at the time that the PCAOB was set up, there was a view around the enactment of Sarbanes-Oxley that the audit was being used and managed entirely as a kind of, according to the study Lynn cited, it wasn't a loss leader, but there was kind of a feeling it was being used like a loss leader to leverage consulting business. The data here just on revenues is worrisome in that respect, because even to the extent that the advising and consulting is not advising and consulting directly to audit clients. The tax business looms very large, and you start to wonder, looking at this, about what is really going on inside the economics of the firms, and we don't know. I mean, the revenue really just is it doesn't really tell you the real story. So what's the role of the PCAOB in this? I think the answer to that really shows the way in which the work of this committee and today's agenda is an integrated whole. Because I think there are two issues that the PCAOB needs to focus on in relation to this problem. And just to restate, the problem here really comes from this kind of the fact that the people doing the buying of this service are not exactly the people who are looking to benefit from it. And that problem is a problem beyond the PCAOB's ability to fix in terms of authority. So what can the PCAOB do? I think there are two things. The first is really what this presentation is about, which is the question of internal governance. And the PCAOB is in a position to understand within the major audit firms what are the internal systems of rewards. Because what I just described, right, that there is a dynamic that sees the audit as literally, a stamp, right? There's a dynamic that sees the audit as a problem-solving function where the problem is how do I get the stamp, right? And then there's the audit as a real sort of system of professional accountability. What are audit firms rewarding their employees and their partners for? And this is something that clients, I think, have no ability to discover on their own, and it's a little unclear how much of it can be made public, right, in any regime. But the PCAOB, I believe, has line of sight into that and needs to police that. And then the second issue, which is really the audit quality indicator issue, which we're about to come to later today, is how can you get enough data into the hands of the people who are actually the beneficiaries of the audit, investors and the public, to be able to kind of deal with this, so that they can act as effective instruments of accountability in relationship both to kind of helping and encouraging audit committees to do their jobs, and in terms of dealing directly, and in terms of being able to directly, particularly across clients, speak to audit firms themselves.
Grant, let me use my authority as a chair here, and with all due respect to Mercer and Ann, we're behind the schedule now, and what I'd like to do is get back on the schedule with the understanding that during the general discussion period, you will be recognized, and I think we will also forfeit the breaks. People who want to get up and down during the discussion period should feel free to do so. I think with your forbearance, Ann. And Grant, I want to thank you very much. You've taken on a very tough subject matter, and together with Brandon and Kurt and Joe and Larry, I think you've given us an awful lot to think about and to contemplate. And I want to thank you very much on behalf of the PCAOB. So, Ann, our final working group topic for today concerns auditor interaction with audit committees. And audit committees clearly play an important role in protecting the interest of investors by assisting the boards of directors in fulfilling its responsibility to oversee the integrity of a company's accounting and financial reporting processes and audits. And to accomplish this objective, the audit committee must hear from the auditor about the audit and the issues identified during the audit. The PCAOB recognized the importance of the interaction between the auditor and audit committees when it adopted AS 16, communications with audit committees last year. And board members, Hansen and Franzel, have been particularly active in this area, and the topic remains an ongoing priority and focus of the board. And is also a subject of considerable interest at the International Forum of Independent Audit Regulators, which Board Chairman Ferguson chairs. And so with that, Ann, I turn it over to you.
Just really quickly, it seems appropriate that we would start this morning with the audit quality indicators conversation and end our formal remarks discussing audit committees, because ultimately right now, given the relative dearth of information about audit quality that's available to the public, it's the audit committee. That's our line of defense when it comes to a high-quality audit. Certainly, audit committees have changed profoundly since the 1970s, which is when I think the stock exchanges first mandated that companies have audit committees. And the Sarbanes-Oxley Act greatly expanded the requirements for audit committees regarding composition and duties. And I think it's fair to say the investor expectations of audit committees are very high. So as I said earlier, we really wrestled with how can we enhance the audit committee's performance. And I hope Brian comes back because we took the liberty of expanding a little bit beyond just the PCAOB's authority to touch on issues that are also more directly relevant to the SEC. Initially, we were going to split up our time and have folks comment afterwards, but I'm thinking we should just go through as quickly as possible our slides and then open it up for comments. So with that, I'm going to pass first to Pete and Bob, who tackled the issue of the audit committee composition, particularly that of the financial expert.
Thanks, Ann. I'll lead her off, and then Pete could chime in. This is the definition of an audit committee financial expert, and I'm not going to read it to you, but I'm going to start pointing out the capitalized ORs. So, an audit committee financial expert is to have an understanding of financial statements and GAAP, is to have an ability to assess its application, and is to have experience with these matters, preparing, auditing, analyzing, or and to get that experience directly, and here's where the first "or" comes in, or by supervising someone that does it directly. Also has to have an understanding of internal controls and of audit committee functions. Ann, are you controlling this? Okay, next one. And here's what's interesting from our point of view in terms of the background of a person that's supposed to do all that. That person should have experience as a CFO, or as a principal accounting officer, or as a controller, or as a public accountant, or as an auditor, or similar functions, or in supervising people that do those functions, or experience overseeing or assessing the performance of companies, or public accountants, or auditors, or evaluating financial statements, and lastly, or other relevant experience. So the point we're bringing up here is if you're counting on the audit committee financial expert to know auditing or auditors or even GAAP, this is pretty nebulous as to whether or not this definition would get you someone like that in all cases.
This is Pete Nockwell. I'll just add maybe one little anecdote, because I shared this with the rest of my subcommittee members, which something my brother always says when he's confronted with, can he have ice cream or hot fudge? He says he doesn't want to be subject to the tyranny of or. He'd like to explore the power of and. And so I think the point Bob and I were trying to get across here a little bit is, there's don't have to have all of these qualities, but you probably need to have more than one in each of the categories. And specifically when it comes to a committee on a large complex company where the audit, not only the external auditors, but the internal auditors are reporting to the committee, to not have somebody who's got direct audit experience is probably a challenge. It's in a gap. It's certainly one that I know our board looks at when nominating governance is looking at financial experts for our audit committee, making sure somebody does have direct audit experience.
So Brian, since you're back, we'll sort of note to you, it's been 10 years almost since that standard has been formalized, and I think we look forward to the feedback from the group, but I think the question is this definition right for today and at this time? Do we have the right folks staffing and sitting on the audit committees? Okay, next issue really quickly is auditor communications with audit committees. Now this is really the only topic we tackled that is particularly germane to the board here. And there have been standards for auditors to communicate to the audit committee for many, many years. In March of 2010, the board proposed a new standard for these communications. After a public comment period, it reproposed a proposal, a standard, and the board adopted the new standard last August. AS 16 largely restated what was in place before. It's in effect now, and the goal is to promote effective two-way communications between audit committees and the auditor. I'll make a side note that I think a really important supplement to sort of the rules, and I'm not a lawyer, I think has been your outreach to audit committees, your guidance to audit committees. Many of them, as we noted from the prior slides, are not experts either. And the more guidance you can give them in terms of how they can do their job better, I think is a very good thing. So I commend you for that work, and I encourage you to strongly to continue that. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all the elements of AS 16. I'm just going to note that, and you can read these, I'll flip through the two slides, and they're in your binder as well. They center in a few areas. First is the company's engagement of the audit firm. Second, the inquiry of the audit committee about matters relevant to the audit. Next, more about the audit strategy and approach, including accounting policies, practices, and estimates, significant unusual transactions, and the audit firm's evaluation of the company's financial performance and other key findings. Our questions here is, can these disclosures be enhanced? I think my practical side is a new standard has just been adopted. I think it's ridiculous to suspect that the board would want to reopen this a year later. But I will note that in approving AS 16, at the same time the board released guidance regarding auditor communications to audit committees, particularly regarding the inspection results. And I think an area maybe worth exploring is whether additional guidance could be issued by the board in conjunction with some of these areas that aren't maybe captured here, but that, as we discuss, investors might find a value or we think would add value to the audit committee. And with that, let me pass to final.
And first of all, I want to introduce, I think all of you know Marty Bauman, who heads up our standards division, and I want to have him have the opportunity to interject as he sees fit. So, Marty, if you want to make any comments about what's been expressed so far, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think AS 16 did a lot in terms of improving the communications in very important ways. But to your point, AS 16 lists also other places in the standards where there are required communications outside of what's in AS 16 itself. And as we continue to look at other auditing standards, for instance, the related parties standard, auditing related party transactions, which have been serious indicators of fraudulent transactions over the years, in that proposed standard and in the reproposal, we've indicated that there are requirements to communicate with audit committees about related party transactions and the auditor's assessment of those. So as we're looking at new standards, and that related parties is a perfect example, we will continue to improve upon auditor communications with audit committees.
Great to know. We'll close our formal presentation with more to you, Brian, and this is going to be about audit committee communications to the public and investors.
I took a kind of opening look at the issue of audit committee disclosure, and what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about what's some of the things that are currently disclosed, and then how to think about this issue. What is the current state of voluntary disclosure in various shareholder proposals, and then talk a little bit about location issues. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's I think the main focus of audit committee disclosures. And it's not so much for reading, other than what strikes me about this is, as I described before, there are things that could be considered to be the conditions of a good audit, and then there are things that are really the meat of the audit, which would be significant issues, problems raised, how they were resolved, how the committee dealt with those issues. And that generally is not a topic for audit committee disclosure. Although if I were an investor, those would be things I'd want to know the most about. Again, because these are always somewhat attenuated relationships between audit quality, whereas problems that are actually exposed and discovered by the auditor, raised, rectified, discussed with the committee, and then disclosed to investors would seem to be the most important driver of how you would evaluate your auditor. The next question is, how would we approach the question of requiring an audit committee to do anything, since the board is the board and clearly has limited jurisdictional means? And if the question is the one on the left, one could argue that this isn't really a board issue at all, in that it is not in the business of just requiring audit committees to do anything. If, on the other hand, the question is, what is it the board believes that shareholders should have in terms of information. I think you could reasonably take the position that if they need information, you clearly have the authority to require an auditor to disclose things and disclose them publicly. One of the things that's a pending proposal is to require auditors to disclose their tenure publicly. And that is obviously something you could also require an audit committee to do indirectly by saying to the auditor, well, you can disclose this list of things publicly yourself, but you don't have to if the auditor committee does so and discusses its treatment of those issues in meetings with the auditor. I know I'm sounding a little bit like a tricky lawyer, but I think that is done, and I wouldn't hesitate to take that approach, but it might seem a little aggressive. So that's sort of one way to think about the issue in terms of what the board could actually do. Another issue was what's happening currently in the marketplace. And what you see here are some Ernst & Young collected examples of common disclosure. They looked at 89 of the Fortune 100 companies, and these were the top voluntary audit committee disclosures, often in response to shareholder proposals. These numbers have gone up in 2013, and obviously some of them are expansions of required disclosure. And they supplement essentially mandatory disclosures such as non-audit services, but they're kind of an illustrative sense of what's happening without any intervention by a regulator. Next, I thought it was interesting to look at the shareholder proposal issue because this is an example of the Brotherhood of Carpenters proposal to, I think it might have been Dell, that the SEC, as it has done with virtually all of the audit committee disclosure shareholder proposals, found to be a matter of ordinary business operations, which as a legal matter is a legal basis for a company to exclude it from the proxy. Interestingly, the SEC has also taken the position that if there is a significant social or economic or other policy basis for including something, even though it is relating to ordinary business operations, that can be basis for requiring the company to include it. Now, if I were thinking as a lawyer, that's the tack I would take. I look at a couple of letters by submitters. They haven't really argued that point, but it is interesting that we have a lot of public policy that is requiring the disclosure by these committees of information, which clearly suggests to me there's a strong public policy issue here. And in fact, you've got an example of the PCAOB is considering requiring the disclosure of audit tenure. Clearly a public policy matter that rises to the level of being required by a regulator. It seems odd to me it's not a significant enough social policy that a shareholder should not be able to put it on the proxy and simply make a request to the board to disclose this information. I don't know whether that's something that the board would be interested in commenting on, but it seems there's certainly some sort of socially significant policies within these lists. And I mean, you could argue that either the board is taking on ordinary business operations in its rulemaking, or the SEC has got it wrong as to what is an ordinary business operation. And then the last slide, this is more sort of concrete, less fact-free, as Curtis might say. This is really attributable to the Ernst & Young report. It made the very good point that a lot of these required communications are appearing, or voluntary, are appearing all over the place. This is a chart that shows 5 examples of voluntary audit committee disclosure, and you can see not only are they appearing in different places, there really is no rhyme or reason to where they've decided to put certain disclosure. So it certainly would be, might be a useful initiative to at least give some guidance or impose some requirements so that if you wanted to find the information that's worth disclosing, it would all be in the same place. And then the final slide is another example of the same issue. Where do you find things that are required to be disclosed? You're required to provide a link in the proxy statement to the audit committee charter. As you can see, it's about a 50-50 split between whether that is specifically in the audit committee report or somewhere else in the proxy statement. So you have to look for it one or the other place in the first place. And then second, the link is to 3 different places when you finally click on it. And in a couple of those cases, it's not to the actual charter itself. I don't think that's a pretty politically challenging position to take, to think that maybe we should look at if information is going to be disclosed, it would be most useful if it were one place and it took you to the actual document that you're supposed to be able to receive. I think that was fast enough, and that's all I've got.
That's it for it. We try to keep it quick. It's the end of the day. And now, honestly, we'd just love to get your input on some of the issues we raised, your feedback. As I said at the beginning, we had more information and questions for you than actual firm recommendations.
Just a question for those here, and thank you for the presentation, Ann. It was really good and insightful and consistent with a lot of the things I've been hearing from some of the audit committee members I've been talking to in the discussions in other venues. So for those of you that sit on audit committees, what stops you today from doing more or all of these voluntary disclosures and more?
Actually, nothing really. It's often kind of balancing the legal requirement against the objective of perhaps full disclosure. And I think with those two choices, many companies would stay with the legal requirement.
Well, Brian, and then Ann.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks, Ann, very much for the presentation. I wanted to just make a couple remarks along the same lines as Marty did, notwithstanding that AS16 was recently finalized. They're still very interested in feedback and still plan to think about the disclosures auditors make and communications auditors make to audit committees. I think it's important to highlight from an SEC staff perspective, it's an area that we continue to be focused on. Staff in my group have continued to spend time doing a lot of what you are doing, thinking about what is the range of what we see in audit committee reports today, and monitor what's going on around the world. In fact, it seems daily, lately, there seems to be activity around the world that is very much focused in the same regard. I think yesterday the UK Competition Authority report contained an interesting outcome, which is a shareholder vote on the acceptability of the audit committee report. Yeah. I'm not sure what the implications of that vote are or how that actually will be implemented, but just to make an illustrative point that we're monitoring these things around the world, considering them and considering the range of the audit committee reporting that we see today. And so we really very much appreciate the feedback in this area and ideas and suggestions, and so just want to encourage the continued thinking and suggestions in this space like Marty has done from an auditing standards perspective.
Ann Simpson.
Thank you. I'm about to sound like a broken record all over again. I think the reason that the voluntary disclosures aren't made is because investors aren't asking for it. And unfortunately, if there is a proposal, we have this bizarre situation where the auditors are working for the shareholders, but the shareholders are not enabled to put forward a proposal asking for something different if that's what they need. So I do think that's a problem that really needs to be addressed. There's another consequence of it being considered a routine business and therefore not for shareholders to bother their heads with, is the fact that broker votes can be loaded into the bucket of yes when auditors are voted. So by calling this routine, a couple of things happen. One, we can't put proposals in, and I think that's a real problem. And secondly, broker votes get cast with the management's recommendation. So I promised earlier I'd ask at the office back at home what happened this season. So in the Russell 3000, my team can only find one auditor that didn't get a majority of the vote. It was Imperial. And because this is a decision to ratify an earlier decision by the management, it's not clear what that vote would do anyway. So so my refrain, my song is get the shareholders for whom this work is ultimately being done, we're the prime user of financial statements, we need audit to work effectively, put us in a position to do our job, and I'm sure much else will follow. But right now, we're really in an awkward position where we can't really see what's going on, and we can't hold auditors accountable, and we can't file proposals, and then broker votes get thrown in and can tip the balance, even when there needs to be change.
Barbara Roper and then Mercer.
Yeah, it struck me when we were looking at this, the sort of like huge disconnect between what we say auditors have to communicate to the audit committee and the qualifications of audit committee members to assess the information that they are required to get. And so, yes, I recognize that it's not the board's responsibility, but since Brian's here, I'll bend his ear on this again, is that to me is looking again at that financial expert requirement. It seems to me to be crucial. When they were drafting Sarbanes-Oxley and they decided to make the decision to rely on the audit committees to perform this crucial function that's really central to maintaining the independence and assuring that the audit is conducted for the shareholders, it struck me at the time as a slender reed on which to build our reform prospects, because the first response of audit committees in the wake of Enron was to send around start adding language to their audit committee reports about how they don't review any of this stuff and they rely totally on management and they're not, it's not our responsibility and we don't have the expertise. I mean, there was this little standard language that some law firm was shipping around. And if the sort of existing body of committees was, their response was to disavow responsibility, it's going to take a huge cultural shift to change that. And I know we've seen some cultural shift, but I'm not sure it's quite that huge. And then, it requires really remarkable expertise to perform that function effectively, and I don't think we got there. That definition got watered down when the rules were being written. So I think that definitely needs to be revisited. And I'm not altogether convinced that this works anyway, as long as, it's the other big unfinished business of SOX is that we didn't really reform corporate boards and the way corporate directors are selected to ensure that they're more answerable to shareholders. And so until you break that kind of logjam and get boards that actually represent shareholders instead of being sort of self-select, by management to not make waves, I don't know how this process works.
Mercer, we're looking forward to your bringing us right back to what's in our jurisdiction. So between Mercer and Joe,
I think that was aimed at me, and
no,
I
it wasn't.
think
No.
what you could.
What we're
No,
trying to
that's
do-
okay.
Listen, what we're doing is we're beginning to expedite the process
Understood.
so people can take the needed break
Let the
that they
record-
probably they want.
Understood.
We want
Rest-
to keep within the context of what we're doing, and then we want to open it up, since I promised everybody, at the end, I didn't say there'd be a free-for-all in terms of the general discussion. You all put a couple of things down on the list. I will tell you what's on the list, and then we can go through that. But in any event, take it away, and then we'll go around the table, finish this one off, take a 10-minute break, and then go to the general discussion.
Okay, so my point here, there's self-help for the PCAOB. What can you do that's within your remit? But you are a creature of the SEC. And what you can't do, but is necessary for you to fulfill your mission, we would ask that the recommendation be that the PCAOB recommends to its partner or
We avoid
others.
the metaphor of creature and
Mercer?
Thank you. Thank you for the chance to comment on my comments. This keeps coming back to, I think, Lou's point that audit committees I expect to be rational actors and to act in their best interest. And I think the answer to why they wouldn't include these is if I put on my lawyer hat, I'm going to tell them to take as little risk as possible, stick to the law and nothing more. And if they do more than that, I'm going to go, if I'm a good lawyer, find what the other lawyers are writing in response to this and use exactly the same boilerplate language. That's what the smart lawyers do, and they're the ones you would want to go to first in complying with this. That's commoditization in the legal world. If you want to change what audit committees are doing, especially in response to marketing that clearly shows that what they're looking for is signaling that the auditor will be flexible, is you have to give them an overriding incentive to create some other result. Now, whatever you want that to be, then you have the incentive fit the result. So if what you want is an auditor that is going to aggressively dig out problems in the accounting, then you have the audit committee required to disclose the 5 biggest problems that the auditor found. Not to disclose significant problems if they exist, because that creates an incentive for there to be no significant problems, and again, hire the auditor that won't find them. You require that they list 5 things, and the auditor is going to have to come up with 5 things. Now, that creates perverse behavioral incentives. Maybe the auditor will make up 5 things just to fill the 5 slots, but at least you've got something out there, and they may be trivial, but that is how you really cut to the jugular of the issue of how to manage market conflicts. But, Jay, my response is, you'd be crazy to jump on these voluntary proposals, putting on, counsel to the audit committee hat, because you are asking for nothing but risk. And I think risk minimization is going to drive most of these decisions. So if the audit committee has to list 5 things, now the risk is I've got to get, my auditor's going to find me 5 things. And if the 6th thing is the one the SEC busts me on and I didn't have in my top 5, I'm in trouble. So if you really want to create a market that's going to work, you have to be hard-hitting in that way and completely change their incentives. Because I don't expect them to follow the spirit of the law. I expect them to follow what their lawyers say is going to be the safest way to proceed.
Norman? Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Dan, and the working group. Great presentation. A lot of issues in here. I'll be brief. It's just a point again on an issue I've raised earlier pertaining to disclosures around the independence review process. I'd strongly second the observation Damon made during the last presentation about the slide from the prior group that showed the allocation of fees among practice or service line in the earlier presentation. The tax numbers are not insignificant, and my sense has been for some time that in an era of increasing pressure on firms with respect to, or companies, or on firms from their clients with respect to audit fees, that some trade-offs have occurred pertaining to tax services, whether it's the tax provision or return preparation or other areas where there's some recapture of fees that are given on the audit side. I think that, when I think of Sarbanes-Oxley, if I describe it or distill it to one word, the word is independence, right? I mean, that is what statute is all about. That's why you all are seated at the head of the table. That's why we're all here. And it seems to me that in this one area where the rubber meets the road, where there are required circumstances in which an auditor has to come forth and seek permission to provide non-audit services to an issuer, we as investors have very little transparency or visibility into what actually happens. And to your question about, I mean, the mandatory disclosures now are with respect to the policies and procedures for approval of non-audit services. I would be a strong advocate of an additional requirement that the actual results of those reviews be disclosed every year, at least in some manner, to describe the number, the nature of the services, the rationale for the approval or the disapproval, so that they become mandatory and consistent rather than voluntary. And it ties in earlier to the discussion about the quality indicators, where we would urge you to gather that information at the firm level.
Proxy statement or audit report.
Sorry?
Proxy statement, audit report, or someplace else altogether. Where would you want them?
I don't know that I have a strong view. I would think the proxy statement would be a good place, because it goes to the question of the candidate's independence and the number of times that an issue has arisen regarding non-audit services that required consultation to occur, I would think.
Joe, you got the last word on this subject.
Thanks, Steve. I debated whether to say anything or not, because I doubt you'll do this. But I do think it's primarily an SEC issue. But you said, you want us to give recommendations on things that the PCAOB can control. And so if you think about these things, and we're talking about the audit committee, we're talking about the expertise, and Barbara is right. If you go back and you look at the original SEC rule proposal on 407, it was much more consistent with what I think people would think is a true expert. And then the business community screamed very loud and very long, and the SEC changed it dramatically. And but we were talking about expertise. We're talking about, we didn't really talk about independence, but there's an increasing body of literature that says economic ties have been banned. But if I'm a CEO and I'm a bad dude, I just put social ties on there. And there's a very, very burgeoning body of literature around that. And in fact, some previous SEC commissioners have been quoted as saying, rather than the board picking top management picks the board. And there's a lot of evidence to that. And so there's issues around independence, there's issues around expertise, there's again a burgeoning body of literature on how board members are selected. And when the CEO plays a heavy role in the selection of board members, the effectiveness of the audit committee not only is reduced, goes away completely. So how does that tie to the board if the board wanted to pursue this? If you go back and you look at the exposure draft, and I'll bring up a bad word, give the board here shivers, of AS2, there was a rigorous discussion of things like expertise. There was a rigorous discussion of the governance committee and how people got on the board in the first place. And I've brought this up in the past when Doug was still around on the SAG, and he said, you know, that just got killed. That got killed by the business community, got killed by the SEC, because there was this perception that the PCAOB was encroaching on the governance space, and that's an SEC space. So, you know, I understand the reality, but these are real challenges, these issues, and so if the PCAOB can't deal with it, the SEC needs to look at it.
Well, Ann, thank you very much. It was a quick presentation, but having said that, it was extremely thoughtful, and also you should know that this issue of communications with audit committees is coming up in the international forum as well. The independent forum of independent audit regulators is bringing this topic up in April at the plenary session. It is not confined with respect to jurisdiction. It's something that the GPPC, which the leaders of the profession will be working on with the investor advisory group. The issues that will come up will be what investors want from audit committees, what audit committees want from auditors, and what auditors would like from audit committees. So this issue of audit committee communications has traction internationally. So this slide deck will be important and will be shared with respect to the GPP's counterparts, which are the leaders of the profession. And I think we'll have some traction with respect to what's brought up at the IFER meeting in April. And that has been recommended by the leaders of IFER, which is Lou Ferguson as chairman, and the vice chairman, Janine from the Netherlands. So thank you very much for this presentation. We'll take a 15-minute break, and why don't we be back promptly at 3:45 for, I'm sure, will be an interesting discussion on a number of issues. Thank you.
Fun sort of. That's right. If any hard questions, something else is coming.
On this audit committee stuff, where was
Yeah, no, I understand. Thank you so much. I really appreciate
Nobody would identify that as a okay, here it is. It's fine.
And when I read the article, they were talking about the security. So that's probably gonna go back and listen to the next section. I can't.
I have a quote on this.
Then I tell you, the CEO and the audit committee, when they're elected, and city clerk are gonna say, we don't want to see our name in that special report of a deficient audit where. Then the audit committee will do the job and say, I want to make sure you've done your work.
But they're making it happen because they have
Exactly, I couldn't see who you were, and then I kind of got you there. I don't know. Well, but I don't know if in terms of writing up, it's better to have it as a, during the wrap-up session. I don't think it's they revisited it. Probably better than trying to whatever the topic is. And then I have to write out I saw Michael send it. So it's the plan that we're going to provide ourselves. Hopefully it won't be too long.
Everybody would say,
That would be a change. I think that would be Laura's preference.
I don't want to see my name. And now you audit. I see those in the hands up. You better not get a good job. You don't want to.
I expect mine to be just a paragraph.
There is an element of arbitrariness. But yeah, we really do need to figure out how to do this.
They wouldn't recognize exactly. But anyway.
right, can we ask everybody to take their seats? I'm taking your seat, Kayla. In terms of this final general discussion session, I emailed all the investor advisory group members to ask them what topics they wanted us to discuss. And they indicated the auditor's reporting model, audit transparency, the status of the PCAOB's work on the ACAP recommendations, which is, I think everybody knows, ACAP refers to the report of the Department of the Treasury's 2008 Advisory Committee on the Auditing Profession, the global agenda, which is something that Ann Simpson raised, oversight of audit committees, and the possibility at all. I think there was enough communication that we're probably not going to bring up fair value accounting. Since the first two topics are under consideration by the board, we've made it clear that all comments will be transcribed, as have the comments of this entire session. But those first two topics deal with the auditor's reporting model and audit transparency. And I should say that I anticipate that this last hour's discussion will be relatively free-flowing, with members discussing issues as they see fit. And hopefully we'll have time before we break for everybody to bring to our attention what is most on his or her mind. So having said that, whether or not we want to start with audit transparency or the audit reporting model, whoever wants to start with that subject matter or either of those, raise your tent card, and we'll start, Ann, with you first, and then we'll just recognize people as they put up their tent cards. So Ann Yerger.
This is Ann Yerger, one of the two Anns. That's the name here. Well, yeah, let me make one comment regarding just auditor report, and it sort of links on to our prior conversation. I know we were talking a lot about audit committee disclosures to investors, but I do want to stress that certainly the council and I, personally, I'm strongly in favor of an enhanced auditor report to the public. I appreciate the benefits of sort of that pass-fail model that's in place, but I think there's terrific important information that the auditors have that I think should be disclosed to the public. Second, let me comment on the issue of auditor transparency. I think that there is no simpler or less expensive reform that should and could be put in place than requiring the disclosure of the name of the partner on the engagement. I think nothing sharpens the mind more than a signature. I know we all have to sign documents, public and or not, and I pay a lot of attention to that. I think it's an incredibly important reform, and I urge the board to move forward with that. Thank you.
Ann Simpson.
Thank you. I'd like to fully support what Ann Yerger has just said. I think the question of transparency on the audit, it's hard to understand who would object to this, who would not be willing to stand and be held accountable for their own work. I recall us having similar discussions around boards of directors 20 years ago about knowing who the board were, what their background was, and so forth. It seems to me just exactly as we were talking about the accountability to shareholders, which is in real need of being strengthened, that sense of personal accountability is extremely important. So we fully support this, and we actually think it will sharpen the discussion in an extremely useful way. On the auditor's reporting model, we'll be putting in comments. I think you'll all remember, I think it was the first meeting that I came to, we looked at the audit report, was one of the issues in the working group that I participated in. And my party piece of the day was to illustrate the problem we had as shareholders by reading you the audit report from Bank of America before, during, and immediately after the crisis. And there was not one dot or comma different. So I think if we can't use the audit report to communicate on critical issues, and many of them are listed out in the consultation, then really this is becoming an exercise in pushing paper around. So accountability will be sharpened with transparency, and quality will most definitely be improved. with this new scope to the audit.
With transparency, there has been an issue raised just in the comment process over the original proposal as to whether it was either useful or necessary or appropriate to have the engagement partner disclosed in the audit report. Whether the same results could be achieved by having a separate form, a Form 2 filing or a special form that we would devise, which would be filed either annually or within a certain period of time following the completion of the audit that would contain this information. That raises also the question of whether you just stick with the auditor's name, the engagement partner's name, or whether you include more extensive information about his or her qualifications and the audit team. Are there any views you have on that?
I would strongly prefer that there not be a second or another filing. The more you make folks hunt and peck for something, I think the less valuable it is. I don't know why you would add, make something more complicated that really doesn't have to be. I don't object, frankly, to having additional information disclosed regarding the background or expertise of the individual. I think that can be helpful as well. But I do think just having the name is a good data point. I think it sharpens the mind, and I think it also can give the audit committee good information as well to compare.
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, an auditor should be proud of the work they're doing. And in the same way that we know more now about the people who serve on the boards, it's entirely appropriate to have that sort of information about the auditor and the audit partner. This is entirely complementary to the improvements we'd like to see to the audit report itself. So if transparency is the watchword, we hope the wind is in your sails. We certainly, as the users, the prime users of this information, fully support what the PCAOB is hoping to achieve.
Norman?
And Stephen, I would
sorry.
just say, sorry, just to jump in on the back of that, I would say that if you are going to disclose additional information, the tenure, that particular engagement partner's tenure is actually relevant and important information and should be included.
Well, as I say, since this is, the equivalent of a comment period as well, you're being transcribed, what are your views in terms of the identification of the engagement partner and the identification of other auditors involved in the engagement?
I would agree. I think the more information, frankly, the better. And I would think that to put that on a separate form probably complicates the issue as well. It should be relatively easy to find.
Norman?
Very quickly on this question, first of all, I violently agree with everything that was just said on the other side of the room. But to take a step further, as some may recall, I was on the working group last year that dealt with the issues around the audit report, and of course we raised this issue at that time. It's an important transparency issue, but it ties in as well to other things we've talked about today, including this issue of whether there is, or perhaps why there isn't, competition for audit services is based on quality. I think that ownership and putting identities with work product, I think, moves us a step in that direction, and it may have some beneficial aspects for compensation issues as well. So I just wanted to point out, I think that it's an important issue for the reasons that both Anns provided, but that it ties into a number of things we've talked about today.
It's extremely important that we get the temperature of investors on this issue, because oftentimes the assertion is made that we only have comment letters from the profession. I mean, the profession's comment letters totally outnumber the comment letters that come from investors or representatives of investors or people who are associated with investors. So, to the extent that you can flush out your arguments, either pro or con on these issues, it's important to get it on the record. Mike?
Mike had, and as far as the additional auditor's report, obviously I was on the similar subcommittee last time and still feel an auditor's discussion and analysis supplemental report would be very valuable. And I guess based on what you said, I have no problem with the supplemental filing. I would just then require whoever the lead engagement partner is that is on the supplemental filing has to sign and be shown on the opinion in their name. I'd give them both instead of one or the other.
Lynn?
The getting the auditor's name, I think, will be very good. In fact, I'm shocked that this thing's been debated for 40 years, and finally it looks like maybe someone will actually do something about it. I agree. Well, let me put it this way. I don't think it matters whether you have a separate AD&A or you include it in the filing, the 10K or whatever filing it is itself. What I'm concerned about is the information and getting the information that you need, and I care less about, which page it's printed on. With respect to information that would be useful to and impact on someone voting on whether or not to retain the auditor, I think that stuff clearly ought to go into the proxy, because that's when investors are most likely to be looking at it, where they're most likely to look at it when making that vote. So I think it probably ought to go in there. I wouldn't do a separate filing out and beyond that. As far as information like tenure and that, as long as it's factual, I think that is good. I asked our CIO at Coopera to survey all of her analysts and portfolio managers, and one concern that they came back and expressed was asking the auditor provide information that would be perhaps turned into spin or hype. They're very concerned about that. They want it to be factual information and information that the PCAOB or someone at least periodically could test and see that it was actually accurate. So at least in that group, they were very concerned about that at Coopera. So factual stuff like years of tenure of the auditor, years of experience the audit partner has in auditing that industry, that type of stuff is factual. It would be very helpful.
Damon Silvers?
Yeah, I mean, I again want to speak to this question of identifying the partner. Like Lynn, I mean, I've been on many bodies that have advised doing this over a period of years, and it just continues to surprise me it's not done, particularly against the context of, for example, the fact that individual attorneys sign SEC filings, the fact that in general we demand a great deal of individual disclosure in our in disclosure systems generally. This is true with respect to boards of directors, to corporate executives. Corporate executives have to individually sign financial statements. This is true to take a somewhat far afield example, but one which I'm somewhat familiar with in the regulation of labor organizations. I mean, a great deal of information is publicly available about me. I'm just an employee, so the idea of sort of some level of personal identification in relationship to important gatekeeper functions strikes me as just totally old hat, and I don't understand why this is controversial, and it's just long overdue, and it ties to what we were discussing earlier. I mean, throughout today, in terms of the problem of commodification, the problem of audit committees not necessarily doing what they're supposed to do. The minimum that the PCAOB ought to be doing in this area is arming the various actors in this process, so that if they choose to want to do their job seriously, they have the basic information necessary to do it. And I would say the most basic information is knowing who's in charge of the audit. Now, I think there is, in addition, I think there is something that has not gotten a lot of attention here, which is the question of who really is, whether we really have a consistent view of quote, who is in charge of the audit. The audit, the big four audit firms and now their global networks. Is it truly meaningful? What does it mean to say that one of them is in charge of the audit without identifying specific human beings? I think if we were talking about, a Victorian partnership, a handful of people sitting in an office together, you might be able to say, well, it's a meaningful thing to say that those 5 people or those 10 people are in charge of an audit. How many tens of thousands of people represent the institution of PwC or E&Y? And is it meaningful to identify them as responsible collectively? I don't think it is. And oddly enough, when we talk about auditor rotation, currently we focus on partners. And the idea that we focus on partners there, but then don't tell anyone who the partners are, it doesn't make any sense to me. So, look, there's always going to be a certain amount of pushback here, but this seems sort of like a minimum thing for the PCAOB to move forward and adopt. And then I'll make then a comment about the auditor reporting model for a moment, just a general piece, which relates to what a number of people said about the danger of boilerplate, right? In any revisions of the auditor reporting model. Again, having seen a number of requirements for disclosure turn into meaningless mush, it seems to me that if you're going to try to get more information in a meaningful way out of the audit process, that then again informs and potentially empowers a variety of actors that surround that including the audit committee itself, but the actors surrounding the audit committee to try to improve audit quality. That those disclosures really have to either be specific testable facts of the kind that I think people have discussed here already today. It was the subject of Ann's presentation. Or they have to be kind of processes or requirements that for lack of a better word, compel either the auditor or the audit committee to disclose sort of things that essentially involve grading on a curve. Of the example of tell me the 5 hardest things you had to deal with in the audit process, the 5 toughest decisions, the 5 most marginal things. A process that doesn't allow you to say, oh, we don't have any. We're all fine here. I can't help resist saying that the president of the AFL-CIO just came back from his first ever trip to China. No president of the AFL-CIO has ever been to China since 1955 when the AFL-CIO was established. If you think about the dates involved, you'll understand why. And he had a great trip, but he was constantly in the process of asking people in various settings. So, does anything ever go wrong here? Do you all ever have does the mine ever cave in? And the answer was always, oh no, never. Now, we all understood that this was part of a ritual back and forth. We don't want to reproduce that kind of ritual back and forth in what we're doing here. And the way in which I think you avoid that is by not allowing, oh, there's no problem, to be an answer.
Joe Carcello. And then let me ask the people who have commented to also respond to the liability issue associated with the, partner identification.
Like the other people who've spoken, Steve, I'll say a couple of comments about both of these. And in terms of the liability issue, I'm not an attorney, so there's people in this room who are better positioned than I to talk about that. But in terms of the audit report, let me just give you a very brief quote, which I'm sure you've seen. I believe the audit is at a tipping point. The audit report at present is hopeless. Now, that wasn't Damon. That wasn't Lynn. That wasn't either of the Anns. That wasn't me. That was Sir David Tweedy, okay? Former Big Four audit partner, former chairman of the IASB. This is as establishment profession as you can get. And I could give you a bunch more quotes like that. So I think it's clear that there's a need. I went back and I reviewed the transcript of the September 2011 roundtable. And people who are opposed to your rules always pull out the boogeyman, right, Damon? Unintended consequences. I've heard that once. I've heard that dozens of times. So here's a quote from Paul Haker at the Capital Group. The mere fact that there's more to say than pass or fail, we think would give, and there was broad consensus on this within the Capital Group, we think would give auditors a stronger hand. They would win more arguments, and we think that would be a good thing. That's an unintended consequence. All unintended consequences aren't necessarily bad. In fact, that would be a good unintended consequence. In terms of auditor transparency, there's a growing body of literature that finds that, in fact, identification or signature is helpful. Much of that literature the board has seen. As others have already said, CEOs, CFOs, chief accounting officers have certified Ks and other documents for years without huge problems. Most of the developed world require the partner to sign or be identified. Virtually all of Europe, China, Australia has not been a problem. And I'll close with another quote from a very bright person. Common human experience suggests that when an individual is publicly identified with a particular activity, that identification usually leads to a higher degree of care and focus. I agree.
Mercer Bullard.
Sure, just a couple of comments on the, the liability issue. Often you hear liability risk used as if it is always a bad thing. I mean, the issue with liability risk is a good liability risk, and then creating the liability is going to create net social benefits. But you almost always hear it as inherently negative. I'm all for reducing liability risk that doesn't create net social benefits, but this is one where I think you certainly would, and it also reflects a trend that you're probably aware of, in that courts have been complaining about holding corporate entities liable and no individuals engaged in the conduct for which they're being held liable. Another problem has been true for quite some time. You have corporations in many cases paying damages. The corporation itself pays the damages to shareholders, who of course the shareholders of the corporation paying it, and no individuals are held liable. You have the SEC now saying it's not going to take no admit, no deny settlements anymore, and pointing out it's going to go after individuals. And this is precisely what we need to do. We need to make individuals responsible because in this sense, corporations are not people. Corporations can't take action without an individual having taken that action. So I think that putting the name and the face on the action will have this behavioral modification effect. It also will be the kind of liability risk that you want. And I think it also, to Ann's point, it really needs to be in the main source of information about the audit. There's a general collective action problem that shareholders have in getting involved in anything. And a big part of the collective action is the information costs. And every time you increase the information costs, you make it much less likely shareholders will engage and be active, because as a cost efficiency issue, it's just not worth it. And in talking to reporters, this is constantly an issue. They will not write good stories if the information is not easily available. And going further, this is an issue that I've been sort of arguing with the SEC about for more than a decade, is it's not clear to me why information is not provided in a way that when you go on useful websites, it's provided where you can click a button and get all the combinations of information that you want that would be relevant. And in the mutual fund world, for example, you should be able to compare 10 funds and see their fees. In the context of issuers, you should be able to compare the auditors. You should be able to compare who's been with what firm how long, who have been the auditors on different projects, what's the disclosure that is related to PCAOB inspections. And you see virtually the government using virtually none of that technology in order to make information really useful. And that is what would really make it actionable.
Mercer, you may have to write that legal argument on liability up in a comment letter. December the 4th, 60 days. It gives you until February. You'll have plenty of time to do this at the University of Mississippi. But we're going to need the legal argument on intended and unintended good and bad litigation costs in the fall.
That was not a setup, Mercer. Norman and Lynn.
Sorry to come back to it. I actually had two things, one of which I think Mercer and Joe have eloquently described. On the issue of liability, I would second the notion that what the ideal and a probable outcome of engagement partner accountability for the content of an audit report and public visibility with respect to the conduct of the audit I would think would be a risk mitigation tool, not a risk not a risk aggravation tool. Secondly, I'm not a litigator, but at the end of the day, when an accounting firm is sued over a allegedly blown audit, I mean, they're the deep pocket, and they're going to remain the deep pocket. I don't know that adding the identity of the partner comes to life early in the litigation in any event through discovery. I don't get the whole thing, to be quite honest with you, about how that adds anything of any material respect to litigation risk or to risks of judgments or outcomes. The other thing I wanted to mention briefly is I was putting my board down when the thought popped into my head, but when Damon gave so many good analogies, I want to offer one more for everyone who's been or is a litigator. I'm sorry the judge isn't here, but many of us in this room have at one point or another in our lives served as an expert witness in civil litigation. And it's not a perfect analogy, but it's close, where we've been asked to examine a body of evidence and to apply judgment and experience to it and render an opinion on one or more issues. And certainly under the federal rules of evidence, we sign the reports. We don't sign our firm's name to the reports, and we are often challenged as to whether we possess the requisite expertise or not. A judge has to decide, and we're deposed, and there is sometimes an exhausting level of review and transparency and disclosure around the contents of our report. I'm not suggesting that same level of inquiry should apply here, but again, it goes back to this notion of when someone holds themselves out as a professional, it's hard to find many other examples where the individual's name isn't on it. It really goes back to the issue we discussed earlier in our group's discussion of audit quality indicators, where I made the point that we're, in that context, assessing or measuring or evaluating conduct. It's the same thing here. The opinion was ultimately reached and rendered by a human being who had authority and responsibility for conducting an audit process. It was not reached and rendered by a limited liability partnership, a fictional legal entity. Now I'll put my board down. Thank you.
Barbara Roper.
First of all, I agree with everything Mercer said and plan to co-sign his letter when he writes it. We were talking last night, we were kind of joking around about the fact that my sister and I have always said that fear of embarrassment has propelled us towards success. The fear, of embarrassment keeps us from ever having gone to class, not prepared, whatever. I think it's sort of a frivolous example, but people behave differently when their name is on there. People speak differently when they're making an anonymous comment in the blogs or when their name is attached to a comment. We know in a variety of contexts that this does affect people's conduct, and affects people's conduct, I think, in this way, precisely the way we want to affect it, which is to make them think more seriously about just exactly how comfortable they are with the opinion they're rendering. And so, I think the benefits of this proposal are self-evident. We've been talking about it for years. And I think, I would strongly support the board moving forward in that area.
And I'm not going to recognize you now because I know that you want to talk about the global agenda, and well, then if you don't, we'll recognize you now, and then you can talk about the global agenda. But that was one of the items in the email correspondence that you put on there. But talk
True
about
enough, but I'm a non-resident alien, so I'm honor bound to talk about other places. No, this was, you said, Steve, that you wanted people who'd spoke in favor of transparency to address the question of liability. So I was briefly going to do that. I agree with what's been said, that these corporate forms, be they joint stock companies or partnerships, corporate forms have other purposes, but these are not moral agents and cannot be held. So whichever Lord Chief Justice way back when said, corporations have neither a body to kick nor a soul to condemn to eternal damnation, at that point, we're then back to people. And whatever has been said about political donations and political speech about corporations being persons, it's nonsense. So if we want to change behavior, the corporation is not something that will behave differently. It's people that will behave differently. And behavior does change under observation. If there are concerns about liability, it is not to be addressed by drawing a veil over the people who are responsible. If there are issues around litigation and liability, they need to be dealt with on their merit. But this would not be the channel, I would suggest.
Okay, Lynn and Damon.
2 points, one to your question on liability and then one back to the basic audit reporting model and the proposal that the staff have recently put out. First on the liability issue, in the state of Colorado, engineers and architects, you can add those to the list of people who have to sign in their own personal name in addition to the CPAs who give expert reports, the boards and all those people. In fact, when you come down to it, the auditors signing these audit reports are about the only people that don't have to put their name down. Everyone else does, and they're the only ones, and there's no good reason why they should be given special privilege whatsoever. And on liability, I chair the Board of Trustee Committee at COPERA that oversees our litigation. I can't fathom us deciding whether or not to sue a firm based upon who an individual partner is. It's going to be based upon whether or not there was an audit report rendered when in fact the belief is that it was a failed audit and a clean opinion wasn't warranted. And in every case I've ever seen go into litigation, no one sued first and foremost the partner and left the firm off the thing. It's ridiculous to even propose that. It's always going to be the firm that gets sued. You go into discovery, and immediately upon discovery, what's the first thing you find out? The partner's name. So the notion that there's audit risk associated here because of liability is a figment of someone's imagination and dreams. It just isn't supported by actual fact. And in Colorado, and I've checked this with the State Board of Accountancy, you're liable as an individual whether you sign in the firm's name or your own name. So it doesn't affect liability in that respect in any way, fashion, shape, or form. So there is no argument on liability on this that is factually based. The second issue on the audit reporting model and the proposal that is comment, I guess, is due on in December, and it's good that something's got out there people can discuss and comment. I'd just say there has been an issue thrown up with respect to that proposal. And depending upon how people look at it, and I've gotten different reads from different people, that proposal may or may not be fatally flawed. And the issue is whether or not that proposal as written would require disclosure of the items set forth, and there's some good items there that are set forth, but whether or not disclosure is required based upon the professional view of the auditor or is based upon what the auditing standards themselves would require to be identified as significant matters. And when the ISB did the old ISB standard number 1, that standard was written and said you have to disclose to the audit committee what in the professional view of the auditor is deemed to be something that the auditor would believe would impact on their independence. Wasn't required to be disclosed from an investor perspective or perspective of the standards. And what we saw when the standard was written that way was the auditors continued to violate black and white independence standards, but didn't put it in the standards letter itself, and came back and always said, well, in our professional view. So it became an unenforceable standard when it was written that way, because auditors always came back and said, well, it doesn't matter what the standard says because it's what in our professional view was. And so the ISB standard number 1 turned out to be basically a fatally flawed and worthless standard. Bill Allen, as someone might recall, tried to fix it. He wrote a letter shortly after it was issued, after he and the other 3 members recognized the fatal flaw, but it never got it fixed, and it's never worked. There's been many, many instances of black and white violations that never were told to audit committees in that black and white letter. So depending upon how you've written it, if you've written it to say in the professional view of the auditor, this is what they would have to disclose, that document is fatally flawed and will never work. And we've got that experience behind us. If it's written from the perspective of here are the significant matters you would have to disclose if the auditing standards would deem those to be significant matters, then you're okay. And I've heard different interpretations of that standard.
This is a valid, very valid point, and I think the limiting case you lay out then is one that the proposal avoids. The proposal requires a discussion of what were the difficult auditor judgments, the difficult issues of supporting the opinion, the complex issues. It further goes forward to say if you decide there are none, you must explain why, how you reached you must document how you got to the decision that there were none. So it is, and it goes further to say that it would be not expected that there would be many audits in which the auditor could conclude there were no critical accounting matters. It directs the auditor to decide and to discuss what were the critical audit matters on the basis of, I think, a stated as well as implied assumption that almost any audit involves some critical audit matters.
But the question,
and that documentation is required of the decision either way. To exclude, if you exclude something that normally would have been reported to the audit committee, you've got to explain why. You've got to document the reason why that would not be a critical audit matter in this case.
But are those critical audit matters determined in accordance with the standards, or critical audit matters determined in the professional view of the auditor? And that's the question.
Well, Lynn, this is a lengthy discussion that we could have, and it's probably beyond this room, and we appreciate your comment letter when it comes in, and we'll address it. But clearly, as Jim just mentioned a moment ago, critical audit matters we indicated would be things that the auditor documented under AS3 requirements, for documentation requirements, would likely be things that the engagement quality reviewer under AS7 had looked at as the most significant judgments in the audit, would likely be things that the auditor communicated to the audit committee in connection with AS16, and went on to say, as Jim indicated, if you have such matters that would appear to meet critical audit matters and have those attributes of having been discussed with the engagement quality reviewer, discussed with the audit committee, documented as a difficult matter, consulted on with the national office, and it's not disclosed as a critical audit matter, then the auditor has to document in the work papers what was the rationale why that was not a critical audit matter. And that documentation, we believe, would be subject then to inspection to understand, is that a reasonable rationale why that wasn't a critical audit matter. So I think it's somewhere in between where you're saying, is it directly driven by the audit standards or judgment? There's definitely judgment involved, but that judgment is linked to existing auditing disclosure requirements in communications with audit committees, documentation requirements under AS3, and things that are reviewed by the EQR and AS7.
So are you saying, Marty, that if the auditing standards would deem whatever the matter was, that it should have been a significant matter, but for whatever reason, the auditor decided not to make it a significant matter, then that would be a deficiency in the report?
Yeah, I'm saying that, once again, if this is a matter that when somebody looks at it and sees the AS3 required documentation of the most difficult matters, and there's a whole list of AS3 of what has to be documented, the most difficult subjective matters in the audit, then looks at what was reviewed by the engagement quality reviewer, and this same matter was a high priority for the engagement quality reviewer. What was discussed with the audit committee? This same matter was communicated and was a significant discussion matter with the audit committee. If that matter does not make it into a critical audit matter, I think it would be very difficult for an auditor to justify how they concluded that that was not a critical
Yeah, but I don't
matter.
think the things will get to that point, Marty. We saw that with the ISB 1 thing. The bottom line was it didn't get to that point of being discussed with the audit committee, and that was the problem.
Well, that would be a violation of AS16 then, if things are missed that not discussed with the audit committee, that should be, and I think we would, that would be something we would inspect against as well. So if people are omitting required disclosures to the audit committee, that itself is a problem, and then we'd have something, we could have an inspection finding with respect to that also.
So you would agree?
Actually, Lynn, let me jump in for a sec. Two things. First, we do look forward to your comment letter. Second, I do think you raise a very valid question with respect to the objectivity of the standard and to the extent that there's judgment and whether or not there can be tightened. You have 5 board members with 5 different viewpoints on it, so I think you ought to reduce your comments to writing, which I think we will review very carefully. Damon, go ahead, and then Mercer. And then I would like to, because we're going to be approaching the end of the session, I did raise other issues that were brought to the attention of the board in terms of what other people might want to bring up. But to the extent that anybody has an issue that they want to bring to our attention, I want to go right the way around the room and spend the last 15 minutes, for you to tell us what you want us to hear, and to the SEC as well. I'm sorry, Brian, your card is up, so we'll recognize you, and then we'll go to Mercer.
Well, thanks, and it does relate to the point we were just talking about, so I'll take the opportunity. I think it's a great discussion we're having relative to what would be a critical audit matter, and certainly there's an open comment period. I think one of the important questions to think about really is the criteria for what is a critical audit matter sufficiently objective, or should it be any more objective than it is? And I think the PCAOB has asked some thoughtful questions in their release around that. Certainly Marty's described the documentation, and others have described the documentation requirements. A question can be asked whether documentation requirements are enough to overcome what some might view as a more subjective definition to begin with. And so very interested in comments as to whether there's improvement that can or should be made to the definition of a critical audit matter in the first instance. But I think the PCAOB has at least been very thoughtful in trying to put forth an initial proposal in that regard. But I think it's an area that could benefit from some focus in public comment.
Mercer.
I'm just trying to figure out the dynamics here. So it sounds like there are scenarios in which the auditor will be exercising discretion, and whichever way they go is going to determine whether they have to disclose something as a significant issue. And if that's true, why wouldn't the disclosure requirement give them a very strong incentive not to take those steps? In other words, decide differently, not bring something to the committee, precisely because that will trigger a different requirement where they don't want disclosure. Or is it objective? There's no discretion for them to make those determinations, because it sounds like taking it up the chain was one thing you mentioned. If I'm the auditor, I'm not going to take it up the chain if it means I'm going to get public disclosure out of that. So how does that dynamic work?
Well, again, I think it's, rather than getting into a lengthy discussion about this item here, I think it's important to read the proposal, read the standard, and raise questions if you think that the way that it's crafted leaves the ability for an auditor to not disclose things and to not meet the spirit of what we're trying to get at here. So I'll support what Brian said, and that is we worked really hard to get a standard that we think would improve disclosures to investors about what's critical in the audit. It's hard to mandate those things that were most difficult to the auditor, because it's whatever was most difficult to the auditor in those particular circumstances. So you can't say what they'd be. It's what was difficult in that particular audit. So as Damon said before, name the 5 things that were the most difficult. Well, we could put a number 5 on it. We actually thought about that, and we asked questions. Should we have a minimum number? So that actually was a question in the release that would help. Should there be any situations where you would not have critical audit matters? That's another situation, another question we asked. So there's lots of ways in which people can comment to us that, listen, you can make this tighter in your final document by doing X, Y, or Z. And I think that's a very valuable comment to get that. But that's sort of the way it's structured. And we had a conversation way back when, Damon, you and I together, and at the SAG also, about, Marty, just have them disclose the 5 toughest matters. And that's sort of what this is. But we are looking for valuable comment about how to make this crisp and tight so that this really does achieve the objectives, and that matters aren't avoided by, well, I'm not going to communicate this to the audit committee because then it will look like it's too critical. So you're right, we don't want to avoid those consequences, but we want to think about all those things. And if there are, in the proposal, if there are ways in which people think that it can be fixed and made even better, we're looking forward to those comments, and we'll move forward on that. We certainly want to have a strong standard here that greatly improves the audit report.
Damon, did your card go back up or? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I thought I heard you before. But by all means, go ahead.
Well, I had two things. Now, after Marty spoke, I've got three. Look, first was in response to your question about liability. I want to just even intensify what Lynn said. I don't understand the argument about liability from the auditing firms. As Lynn pointed out, it is a trivial matter in litigation to get the name of the partner. And the notion that somehow the lack of disclosure of the name in non-litigation situations is going to promote that somehow protection against litigation, I think, is not a serious argument. And I would urge the PCAOB, to the extent that firms that auditors are making a litigation argument, and this doesn't even get into Mercer's point, right? I'm just saying I don't get what the argument is, and I think the PCAOB needs to sort of insist people make this argument, be specific as to what they think exactly is going to happen. But I think if you follow the thread of that logic through a little bit, you get to a deeper issue. So if litigation is not the point, what is the point? Why do investors want to see this name? And the reason is precisely because you want to be able to engage in types of accountability that don't rise to litigation, and you want to facilitate that on the part of investors who may not have the muscle to get it on their own, right? Because I think, in addition to the fact that litigation can get that name, look, if you hold 3% of a company's stock, you can probably get that name. Right? It's probably not that hard, in fact, to get that name. What's absent, though, is in this regime, the existing regime we have, is the sense of a level playing field in the securities markets. That is what, in fact, the audit report is all about in the first place. I mean, why? You know, we've had this conversation today, and people have talked about what is an audit report for. Well, increasingly, I think, and I think Joe said this earlier, that there's a real danger here of the sort of the diminishment of the value of the audit report in general. And what's going on right now, and it's visible to me in terms of at least what is now, 10 years of this body's existence, and going back to the period, immediately before this body was created, this body being the PCAOB, that what has increasingly happened, I think, is that the securities markets have become, for a variety of different reasons, and a lot of people have talked about high-speed trading as part of this, but that's not all that's gone, not the only driver of this. The securities markets have become increasingly hostile to the involvement of investors who lack enormous scale and enormous resources. If you have enormous scale and enormous resources, there's a sense in which maybe you don't need an audit report. You can send your own team of financial experts in to talk to a public company. You've got, in a variety of ways, if you've got that kind of scale, you can have, if you're BlackRock, you can have that conversation, closed doors, demand whatever metrics you want, get whatever you get, make your own conclusions. Maybe for any given public company, there are 20 investors who can do that. Everybody else is kind of left in the dark. As as financial statements have become more complex, as the ability of firms to essentially play games with financial statements has grown, and in parallel, as trading processes have become less friendly to smaller investors, you have an overall drift away from a level playing field in the markets. Identifying auditors by name is by no means a solution to this problem broadly writ, but it pushes back on it a little bit.
I've got to ask you, is this about making small investors feel good about large, complex, and impersonal markets? Or is it about having them think they have information that other people have and feel better about it that way? Or is there something of use to them? What utility is it for them to have the information, given the situation they're in, which you and Ann have so articulated?
Yeah. I think that's a very fair question, and I think that there are two answers that go beyond feel-goodism here. I think the first is that it will be possible for a wide variety of actors, academic actors, providers of public, the press and other sort of providers of public analysis, right, to look at the behavior of individual partners across companies. That is, and tell investors things that are meaningful. The second thing I think is possible is that I think there is a landscape between really the small investor, the individual investor. There's a landscape between that party and the very largest players who have the resources and the market leverage to extract information sort of willy-nilly from companies. And those, if you look at the history of corporate governance reform in the United States, it's often been those investors who have pushed the envelope on things. And using publicly available data as opposed to what they can extract as a private party. I think that was certainly true in the initial push for auditor independence, in the push around board independence. A number of those funds are ones. This is certainly true of a lot of funds that are collectively bargained in one way or another. I don't think this is a transformative move in relation to any of these dynamics, but I think it pushes it the right way, and I think it's not feel-goodism.
Well, I want to begin the wrap-up period here and just start, Brandon, with you, and just go right the way around in terms of any final parting shots that you would like to leave the board with in terms of what we should be doing to improve audit quality and protect investors.
Well, I do think that the signature makes a lot of sense, the same way we do it with mutual fund portfolio managers and the like, where the SEC has been much more aggressive. I discount the liability issues for the various and other sundry reasons. The context of the discussion today, though, I think really goes to the audit quality indicators in the morning and getting those built into the governance process, because as Kurt highlighted, and as various have referred to, basically the relevancy of the audit, getting more of that quality and ultimately going to the quality of earnings so that there is more value extracted rather than check the box from the audit would be valuable. I should say, however, that while greater transparency to the audit is important, we would be worried if we lost the pass-fail. We think that we would not want to see the greater transparency degrade the pass-fail. I don't think it needs to, but I did want to at least highlight our concern along those lines.
Kurt?
So I think the audit quality initiatives are key. I think that what I'd like to see happen is the PCAOB start to get into a position where it can comment on, are we seeing improvements in audit quality, and what's the state of the profession? They answer a lot of the questions that are unknown about the quality of the people that are carrying this out. So I think we need to know is the profession having the right people in place or not?
Grant?
I think I'd like to see the board take a further look into some of the issues, the governance issues that we talked about, where you do have access to information, because I think a lot of the sort of presumptive reactions that people have were based on very surface level knowledge, and that you really ought to delve into it and see whether there's there, and then move accordingly from there.
Grant, we certainly welcome you to the Investor Advisory Group.
Yeah, I've been trying to think about how investors will react to a lot of what we've talked about today, and I can't envision I think it's hard to imagine a situation where investors go in and short stocks of companies whose audit partners have shown mistakes in the past, and buy really strong audit companies. I don't know that that's going to happen. And before we get to that point, we'll see trading cards with auditors on the face. And I think at that point you really do end the worry about commoditization. But I really do have a sense that we need to get to more information. And I don't know how the market will use what we've talked about with audit quality indicators, or how they're going to use identification of the partners responsible for the audit. Perhaps the identification of the audit committee chairman. I don't know how it will be used, but I think that there's an invisible hand that will ferret that information out, and it's a process, and we'll get better at this. And maybe we have 70 indicators that we disclose round one. It turns out that there are 35 that are helpful. The market will figure that out and migrate towards those indicators. And so I'm all in favor of more information rather than less, even if we don't know how it'll be used or which ones are going to be the most helpful. But I'm very encouraged by what we're talking about today.
Thank you, Damon.
So, since the chairman caught me in my train of thought, I left out my comment for Marty. I'm just going to make that. I think it's quite dangerous to have even with the caveat that you don't expect to see very many of them. I think in the reporting model, it's very dangerous to have an option of saying no, we don't have any serious issues. I think it raises this issue of then all of a sudden auditors it becomes tricky to push issues in the internal process. I think if you do that, I stand by what I said to you however long ago that you're citing, which is put a number on it, 1, 2, 3, 5, whatever that number is, and everyone has to disclose what it is. Every audit has an issue. It's not possible to have an audit without an issue.
Norman?
Nothing new to add other than to thank you all for having us and for inviting us to be participants. And I'll say we've covered a lot of ground today, not only in the panel specific discussions, but certainly here at the end. And I think when you take a step back, you realize that the issue of quality is the silver thread that connects it all, and the need to define it, to measure it, to report it, and to use it as a tool for improving or providing safeguards around audit quality. And I think there's further work to be done. So by way of parting comment, I'll say that rather than show up again next year and see where we are, I'm happy to continue being supportive in any way I can as the staff moves forward.
Thank you very much. Tony Sandi.
Thank you. I'd like to simply emphasize what I thought was the two main things I said this morning. One is that, as Norman just said, audit quality is the critical issue. But if you develop indicators that are based on audit firm quality and audit process, and not focus on audit quality, I think we're going to miss very significant opportunity. I think it's absolutely critical that we focus on audit quality. The second point I want to make is that what the discussion today showed is that there are concerns. I understand that the nexus where the output-based indicators meet financial reporting quality and some of the other issues that Lynn and some other people have raised, and Joe, I think that although that nexus is a difficult one, I think that should not get in the way of developing really good audit quality indicators and being very firm. The complexity shouldn't get in the way.
Bob.
I hope this is not off topic, but as you said, you were hoping to get what was on our minds at this time. My question, or something that I think at some point I'd like more explanation on, was the issue around the Chinese reverse merger issues, and most specifically, in fact, this might just go to harmonization of global accounting standards. But the differentials that existed between the Chinese accounts and the accounts that were ultimately reported here, I think the collapse that we saw in the investor losses that we saw across a wide range of those companies was really a black mark on the U.S. capital markets. And so my questions are more around, one, how was this allowed to happen? In other words, that these companies were able to sort of, from an accounting and audit perspective, slip under the radar. And then secondarily, are there processes that we can put in place to ensure that that situations like that do not recur again?
Audits were ostensibly performed where we have reason to believe now there was no work done. In some cases by registered firms within China, in some cases by registered firms in the United States, which are relying on firms in China. That situation has received a lot of attention, both in the area of enforcement, which will continue as an interest that we have, but also in our relations with the People's Republic. We are continuing to press for a joint inspection regime. I think that unless we can get to a position in which our Division of Inspections can go to China and can satisfy themselves about the quality of the audits that are being used to issue securities or trade securities at the secondary market here, we will have to move toward deregistration of firms, and that will have, of course, implications for markets. It'll be something that we will have to work out with our colleagues at the SEC.
Ann Simpson.
Yes, I had 2 points, one of which I think Robert has referred to. So CalPERS invests in 47 markets worldwide, and regulation is a global game. It's not just true of account audit, it's accounting, securities law, capital adequacy for banks, you name it. And we're struck that although there are the multiplicity of regulators, the core of the regulatee is the big four, maybe plus two. So the work that you're doing to cooperate and coordinate is really important, but I hope it's also a weather eye to the fact that these public agencies are stumbling over each other, themselves and each other, dealing with four business networks. And I don't know what the solution to that is, but that is something I would have talked about. So I really encourage that work that you're doing, and thank you very much for it. And if there's anything more we on the investor side can do to support you, please let me know. And the other thing, my closing comment is that with regard to audit, shareholders are weak and ill-informed. And you can do something about the ill-informed part, and our friends at the SEC can do something about the weak part. So I hope that we can make progress on this, because all this good work on quality and disclosure and all the rest of it, if we can't, both speak softly but carry the big stick, if there's no stick, if we can't move in as the shareholders, and be Teddy Roosevelt in style, it won't work. But thank you for what you're doing. We greatly appreciate it. I think the PCAOB is doing tremendous work. We very much value what you do. Thank you.
Jan Yerger.
Well, let me echo the thank you. This is an energized board, and we really appreciate it. You've been bold, I think, recommending and proposing reforms, and I think on behalf of investors and the council, we really appreciate it. I would urge you to maybe get one easy or seemingly easy win, and that's the auditor or the engagement partner transparency. I think it just seems like that's not a complicated reform, and it would be great to just push that across the finish line. I think the second point is, as everyone else has said, this is all about audit quality. I think the work that you're doing on audit quality indicators is profoundly important. So I commend you to move forward with that, but also to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I don't know that there's one perfect prescription for how to do this. And this could get analyzed forever without a resolution. I think it's important to move along. I do believe public disclosure of audit quality indicators is very important. I do think it's an interim step, issuing some guidance, additional guidance to audit committees, so they have a better arsenal of questions to be asking on audit quality. I think could be very helpful as well.
Mercer?
I just would probably emphasize that the way I see the quality issue is really something bigger. It's more of a value-added issue. It's not so much quality to prevent fraud. It's to make the case for public companies. Because from the securities law perspective, what I see is 15 years ago, there were twice as many companies on the New York Stock Exchange as there are now. Over the last couple of years, more money was raised in private markets and IPOs than in IPOs. You see Facebook trading on private markets, millions of shares a day. So liquidity is now going out the window as a reason to an IPO. You have the Jobs Act that's now eliminated, and this was the first meeting since the SEC adopted rules, eliminated the general solicitation and advertising, which I think will have a geometric effect on the advantageousness of private offerings. Jobs Act also expanded the number of investors that require you to go public, and also excluded certain investors from being counted. And the SEC takes a very liberal view as to how you count pass-through entities toward that, and that'll also another reason you'll have fewer public companies. It's hard to know where this is all going to go. The trend is pretty clear, but I think the brand that is the public company, especially with steps that have essentially made what it means to be a public company be different things for different companies, 404 here, 404 not there, has really put the public company brand at risk. And if you want to look at a specific threat to the importance of honest accounting, look at the filing of confidential registration statements, where I looked at about the last 10 that have been done, and you see 3 to 8 confidential filings. And these were prompted, this rule was prompted by a company that you all recall went public and had repeatedly to go back to its registration and correct what were pretty blatant accounting abuses. If you were to go into those confidential filings and you did a lot of work, you'd probably find the same thing. And that is, this is a market that is becoming more and more for retail investors only. If you are going to go public now, it seems to me the biggest reason to do so is to sell to the least sophisticated group, because you will have gotten all the money you needed out of institutional investors and and accredited investors before you go public. Because one of the key classes I teach is the pros and cons of an IPO, and most of the pros are disappearing.
Pete?
Thanks, Steve, and thanks to the board for putting this group together and reaching out to us for input, and more importantly, maybe the staff for doing all the hard work to pull it off. So much appreciated. Maybe 3 quick comments I'll canter through. One, I do agree audit quality indicators is a key thing coming out of the discussion today, but I think it has to be married up with heightened expectations for audit committees, because there's got to be 2 levels of this. One that I think the PCAOB is ideally suited for, of looking at firm level quality, but where the rubber meets the road is individual audits, and audit committees are going to be in a best position to really judge, are they getting quality, both people, the scope, and the work plan that's put in place. And then hand in hand with that has to come kind of heightened focus on what's a financial expert, particularly if we're saying the auditors, the external auditors and the internal auditors are reporting to the audit committee, making sure we have somebody who is able to, on those audit committees, really manage that work. Second topic, and I'm mindful of something, Kurt will know the author of this statement, but everything's been said, just not everybody said it. But I'll jump in on the audit opinion, audit reporting model. One, I do agree around the transparency on having audit partners. I don't know why that would be any different than the professions that Lynn listed, or responsibilities that people like I have to certify financial statements that we submit to the SEC. On the other hand, I think we've got to also be mindful of the dichotomy that we can't be aghast when we see marketing material with firms saying, well, the individual signing partner has responsibility. So we've got to be careful a little bit of what we wish for. And I think at the end of the day, be mindful of the fact that we are, when we're buying an audit from a firm, we're buying the firm, and that's what we want. But I do agree it crystallizes the focus of that partner who ultimately has the signing pen. But there were a couple other aspects of the reporting model. The critical accounting matters, I do think, can be an interesting expansion, but I think we've got to be practical about it. So how does that marry up with management's disclosure on critical accounting policies and estimates? I would envision there'd be a pretty parallel set of disclosures there. So if it's just duplicative, do we get anything, or do we just put more cost and time into the process of getting audits and financial statements prepared? So whether we kind of road test that or find some way to say what's the practical aspects of it, and then how do we make sure it doesn't end up being heavily lawyered, and no disservice to the legal profession, but they're going to represent their clients, in this case the Big Four. If we end up with 50 pages of boilerplate in their audit opinions and we can't find the pass-fail, which I think when I talk to our portfolio managers and analysts who are managing $650 billion of investor money, the thing they want to know at the end of the day, did they pass or did they fail? Because I don't have enough time to go through all the rest of the aspects. And then last but not least, being the author of the fair value accounting, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, Steve, because I know it's an issue we could spend eons on. But just to be clear on what I think the issue is there, which is the pro-cyclicality of fair value accounting combined with the false precision that when you take numbers out to 2 decimal places and it's fair value and it's judgments and estimates on top of judgments and estimates, it's important that I think somehow we have investors understand A, that level of imprecision, and B, the pro-cyclicality that's just as bad in an environment that's being fueled by quantitative easing as it was in 09 and 010 when there was a dramatic cycle down. So enough said. Thank you.
Barbara Roper.
I think at some point in all of these meetings I say that the audit only has value to investors if it's conducted with an appropriate degree of professional skepticism. And we have seen a persistent problem with insufficient professional skepticism, which I think is arguably the main driver of low audit quality. So I would sort of review each of these issues we've talked about today through that lens of to what degree is there potential through, whether it's audit quality indicators or whatever, to drive a higher degree of professional skepticism in the conduct of audits. And toward that end, I actually think it's the issues that Grant's subcommittee was working on in terms of incentives and governance, where there's a rather large, largely unexplored potential for further progress in terms of driving toward a more independent and skeptical audit.
Bob Cirola.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I guess I want to say I hope that you don't marginalize the audit committee. They're the primary body responsible to the shareholders. And I'm going to also be in favor of a pass-fail model, auditor report, for that very reason, is that if there are difficulties in auditing an enterprise, let the audit committee explain those difficulties. The management of the enterprise has an obligation to do good accounting and disclose how they did it. So if an auditor just comes behind them and says, they did good accounting, we audited it, and we're happy with it, I'm not sure what the benefit of that is. But if you have the audit committee explain how they monitored that audit with respect to those difficult issues, I think the investors, I think the system works better. Let me just say that. I am in favor of transparency of the signer of the audit opinion. I think that there should be no difference between that signature and that of a CFO on the financial statements. And also, I think if you're going to support the audit committee's role, then you also have to look at the qualification question.
Thank you, Bob. Joe Carcello.
Yeah, in the interest of time, I think we're talking about the right things. I think the board's looking at the right issues. I just would second what Ann Yerger said. Let's get some things across the goal line.
Judge Forkin, we've just gone around the table concluding, and we asked everybody for their final comment in terms of what they would most like the board to address in terms of improving audit quality and investor protection. I know you've mentioned 10A in the past, but whatever you want to wrap this up with would be most appreciated, as long as you keep it under 5 minutes.
No, I just got a few seconds. I agree with Chairman Doty's view on the signature on the audit. I think that the person who has done it has got to sign it. I think that should be a no-brainer. The only other thing I think I didn't hear whether there was much discussion, but 10A of the Securities Exchange Act is an extremely important provision. And I would like to see some emphasis on that provision, because I do believe that it is not being followed the way the drafters of the provision want it to be followed. So I would hope that you put that on your agenda.
Judge, in terms of the transparency, since the
Yeah.
transcript, this is an open release, why do you support it?
Well, when I say it's a no-brainer is why shouldn't the person who has been involved sign it? I don't understand why that there should be any question. It seems to me that if he knows he's got to sign it, he knows that it's got to be credible. I'll tell you this, as a lawyer, that when I sign a pleading in court, I want to make sure that it has what I want in it. There have been pleadings that I have, even though I've been co-counsel in cases, there have been pleadings that I have refused to sign because it didn't have what I thought it should have. And it seems to me the accountant will have to make sure that he believes in it before he puts his signature. He's not going to put his signature on something that he has any question with. He's just not going to sign it.
Are there any final closing comments that board members would like to make? And then I'll just make a very brief one. No? Well, in that case, I want to thank everybody for what I consider to be an excellent meeting. We very much appreciate the leadership of the working group members, all the members on the working group, the entire membership of the Investor Advisory Group. And I personally especially want to thank Nina Majuri-Assad and Topi Falarin. Pete, you hit a home run. You mentioned that this is not possible without really extraordinary staff support. And I'm very lucky because I've had that support. And so, Nina, I want to, wherever you are, I want to thank you. And Tope, I want to thank you. And Joanne, you set the marker, and I can think that we're carrying the ball forward with respect to our Investor Advisory Group. So thank everybody for participating.
Good.